Court order. Taylor, please do the roll.
Mark Nonig.
Here.
Terry Cohey. Carl England. Diane Fladmo. Here. Jack Prothero. John Satry.
Here.
Maggie Peterson.
Here.
Jeff Greenfield.
Here.
Senator Sales.
Here.
And Representative McCarthy.
I think he's in Australia by now, isn't he?
Somewhere.
Now is the time where I give the notice. Yeah, notice of video recording. RTP is my partner, so no problem. Remember, you are on video and being recorded, so when you make comments, keep that in mind. Now, next on the agenda is the public comment. People who wish to make public comment on items that are within the jurisdiction of the board but not on the agenda. Do I see any? Seeing none.
Well, hang on. Does any, we had a guest here who was going to be here. She's here.
Katie's here.
Yeah.
Did you want to address the board?
Okay.
You may if you wish.
Right now.
Certainly.
Well, in fact, to process, this is your time to address the board if you want to address the board. You don't have to, but you talked about issues. If you want to say something to the board, this is the slot for it.
Okay, I can.
So if you want to just
Yeah.
come up here, you can introduce yourself and if you would
Should I
please.
sit?
Sure.
Okay.
If you're comfortable doing that.
Hi. My name's Katie Sutton, and I'm the director of Montana Organizing Project. And we work to connect faith groups, civic organizations, and labor to amplify issues that are important to them. And in the past, we've helped to make sure that payday lending doesn't exist in our state, or at least it has been regulated at 36% interest. I'm sure you guys are aware of that. And I've been learning a little bit about private equity and investing and that sort of thing. And what I've seen is that Montana as a state has invested in the past $25 million to an organization called JLL Partners. And after we invested that money, they absorbed Ace Cash Express, which is a payday lending company that doesn't exist in the state of Montana. They don't make loans here because it's technically outside of our regulations. And so we're not investing in our local economy by investing in organizations that are outside of our state, especially when they're doing things that are predatory. So the payday lending is predatory. And then I saw that recently we invested another $25 million into JLL Partners. And so I just wanted to see if there was a way, just wanted to understand why we are investing in companies that don't exist in Montana, and if they're regulated in the state, whether or not we thought it was morally valid to be investing in something that's predatory that our Montanans have said that is something they don't even want in our state. Does that kind of make sense? I hope. I wasn't prepared to actually speak, so.
You want to make any comments?
No, I think that the process is the process. I'm aware of her concerns. I'm aware of this issue of payday lending. I'm aware that others have raised the issue with us. We are aware that the phenomenon of payday lending has different boundaries and limits in the state of Montana versus other states. I have let our private equity managers know of the public's concern about it. It's not a defense of the actual issue itself. It is a very small set of a small set, but regardless of that, it is true that this particular company has a small portion of its business is payday, but regardless of that, and I guess the comments that I have, first of all, welcome. I think it's important for the board to hear members of the public. We don't hear very much. I think one of the challenges that the board faces is that as a fiduciary for retirement funds, the board is, I won't say that it's indifferent. It's not indifferent, but at the same time, there are any number of areas of capitalism, because it's about capitalism, that are controversial. We don't see controversy. But I think the board's position as a fiduciary, we're trying to balance risk and return. Nevertheless, I think it's entirely appropriate, and although I'm not the arbitrator, you're the public, you get to say what we should listen to. So it's an issue that as the executive director, I've thought a lot about it. This is sort of in the area of socially conscious or social investment or whatever. And I won't say that we're indifferent to it, we're not. But we have this challenge of being fiduciaries to retirement funds. And that's about as much as I can say on this as far as a response.
But I just would add a comment to it. My thanks too for coming here. Appreciate your comments. I would echo one thing that David mentioned, and that is that it may or may not be, you may or may not know this, but you're not there alone in bringing us issues about the nature of companies in which we invest and whether or not they're in the best interest of the citizens of Montana. And those are good things for us to hear. But we do have that, we have faced the issue before of our limits as a fiduciary and whether we can certainly listen and take into account your question and your comment. We appreciate it. But there's an extent to which our policy as a result of fiduciaries couldn't, I think, in my personal and sort of legal opinion, couldn't go. But you're not asking us to do that. I'm just making that as a general comment. So does that make any sense to you?
A little bit, yeah.
I'm sorry, what?
I said a little bit. I think I'm following.
Anyway, I appreciate your coming. Anything else that you want to add?
No, just wanted to make sure that Montanans are protected, and since we have an opportunity to stand up for other states that don't have payday lending restrictions, I mean, we cap the interest rate at 36%, and which is already more than all of our credit cards, and in other states it's up to 350% interest or 450% interest, and I've even seen online loans that get up to 950% interest, and so that traps people into a cycle of debt that they can't get out of, and it's predatory. They don't, when you pay back your fees and you flip your loan into another loan, you get fees, and then it just doesn't ever go towards the principal, and it's just a really poor business model, especially if we want to protect people. And I think that as a state that saves $37 million a year annually, estimated, not having these loans, it's worth making sure that all Americans are protected from these loans too. So,
Thank you.
thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Anyone else have any comments, public comments? Okay. Now, see none. Can we move to the Yes. Oh, you know that. We do want to welcome our newest member, Diane. Welcome to the board. And it's a good thing you're here because we wouldn't have a quorum.
It's a good way to start.
Okay, now we're on to minutes, right? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Minutes of the February 13, 14 meeting.
I would move approval.
I would second that.
Further discussions on that? Seeing none, all in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Now, we're out of order, see if you would have
No, I'm
been
sorry.
patient with me, I would introduce the new board member kindly. We do have a new employee, however, and I'll leave that one to David since he's now in control of the project.
Well, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Thomas Winkler, who is a private investments analyst for us, a recent hire, I believe previously from Oregon. Do I have that right?
Washington, yes.
Washington, West Coast.
West Coast. Western here, yes.
So welcome. Thank you, Ron.
Welcome to the board. Thank you. Okay, now we're going to move on to committee reports. So
Okay.
We'll start with John,
The
and the audit committee, I should say, because we'll see you again.
Oh, yes, yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The audit committee met this morning, and all the members were there except Senator Sales. I guess all the board was there except Senator Sales. We received a briefing on the 2017 financial audit follow-up, which, as people remember, we had a couple of issues that we needed to take care of. The Legislative Audit Committee did officially meet and accept the report. Staff and some board members were present to make comments and give information to the committee. It was a very positive discussion, and we have some action items coming out of it. One of which is that we are preparing a report right now, David is, along with Julie, for incorporating all the suggestions and recommendations that were in the audit committee report, and we're in the process of doing that. Additionally, the audit committee will want to meet with David at their next meeting, which is June or July or sometime around there. Anyway, it's working well, the staff is reacting well, the board is reacting, in my opinion, well, and I think this will be a positive growth for all of us out of this. Next item we talked about is we had an RFP out for the internal controls auditor. We asked for two different prices this time, and for two different types of audits. One is an AUP audit, agreed upon procedures, which we have typically done for the last 9-10 years, whatever it may have been. We received one response to that. We also asked for a price for an SOC 1 or 2 audit, and we received 4 different prices for that. The audit committee, upon reviewing that information, talked some about what we want in terms, what type of audit we want, the AUP or the SOC. The SOC is a more stringent kind of audit than the AUP, and it's for internal controls, and the audit committee is recommending that we proceed with an SOC audit this year instead of an AUP. The cost is about $20,000 more than the AUP, but given the great scope of things, we think that's probably beneficial and well worth the money spent.
Hey, John, you want to, excuse me for interrupting. but
Sure.
Can you tell us the acronym, service organization?
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
And then just a quick highlight of the difference.
Yeah, the AUP, well, and the AUP, the agreed upon procedures audit, is less stringent than the SOC. The agreed upon procedures, the board staff sort of dictates the areas and places that are audited by the auditor. For the SOC audit, the SOC auditor comes in, establishes essentially their own parameters of what they want to look at, areas of interest they want to look at, review them, and then write an opinion about it. It's a more stringent kind of process, and it provides a document and information that can then be used by other people who want to determine where we stand with our internal controls.
Okay.
Okay, so the audit committee believed and voted unanimously to proceed to recommend to the full board that we do a SOC 1 Type 2 audit, and we need full board approval for proceeding in that direction. So as chair of the audit committee, I would move that the Board of Investments proceed with a SOC 1 audit.
For a second,
I would second that.
third discussion about that. Okay. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That one carries. Thank you.
And then the next item related to that is we have 4 vendors. One is out of the competition because of the point scoring system in the procurement process. Another vendor has elected not to continue on and proceed, so we will do interviews with 2 vendors, and Jerry will be setting that up in the near future. The interview team will be the same team that was the evaluation team. Any questions about any of that? Third item was Julie Feldman updated us on the financial compliance audit for 2018. And the main bit of information is we will be having an entrance conference with the legislative auditor on, we think, 4/17/2018. And that's the report of the audit committee.
Any questions about that? Okay, and thank you. We'll move to the Human Resources Committee in the absence of Carl.
In the absence,
You were nominated.
in the absence of Carl, I was the acting chairman of the Human Resource Committee. I'll get to the executive director comments second. The first issue is we have a revision to the organizational chart, which can be found in the tab. The essential change there is that an investment analyst under risk management is being shifted to a position as the investment analyst under the director of investment operations. It was explained to the Human Resource Committee that that person will be moving to that spot, Tim House, and that he will be taking many of the similar duties he was doing with risk management with him to the investment operations branch, along with assuming some other things that are going on. And the board needs to approve this change to the organizational chart. The Human Resources Committee voted to recommend to the board that this organizational chart be adopted, and as acting chairman, I so move.
Want a second? Moved and seconded. Further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The motion carries. Thank you.
Then the other bit of business we did, we acknowledged that Executive Director Ewer is planning to retire, and we thank him for all of his service. I'm nowhere near as eloquent as Carl would be with all of this, but it's been a privilege to work with David all these years. I think he's done a lot for the board. I think the board has done a lot. The board and staff have done a lot to support David, and there's been some very key, incremental, and important changes that have been made over his 7-year tenure. And it's been a privilege and a pleasure to serve with him. And I don't know if you want to say anything, not to put you on the spot, I don't know if you want to say anything, but.
It's been a tremendous privilege, and I look forward to continue to work with you and for you for the next 6 months. But it is time to provide someone else to provide leadership to the board. So thank you. Great privilege.
I'd like to say that.
Yeah, please, Mark.
I don't necessarily need to be the only one, I guess, but I'm not going to give a long speech. It's not my nature. I just want to say that since I think I mentioned, my first chore when I became a member of the board was to vote for the executive director. That was David, and I've known David since the legislature. And all I want to say is I think he has done an excellent job, and he and I had an extremely good working relationship, which I totally appreciate. And I hope we can get even half of that with the next executive director, and then I'll be comfortable, assuming I'm still here. But those are my comments, David. Congratulations on your retirement, and thank you so much for your great service. John, I didn't mean to interrupt your.
No, please. Good. And congratulations also, David, on retirement. Thank you. So now that we've said nice things, I'm a little unhappy because now we have to hire a new executive director. And I was on the committee that hired David, and it's a lot of work, and Jerry can testify to that, I'm sure. But towards that end, we have scheduled a board meeting for this Thursday at 3 p.m. To discuss how we will establish the process for selecting the executive director. Unless I'm missing anything, I think that's the report of the Human Resources Committee.
And I think that covered everything. Any questions? Thanks, John. I And now we will go to the loan committee, and
And with the absence of
Otherwise,
Jack and
it's-
Terry, it kind of got dumped on me here, but thank God I had Mark to vote with me. So the first item that we had to deal with was in the in-state loan program, and Doug brought forward a request by Cinch Holding LLC, which is an Ace Hardware franchise out of Laurel. And just, I want to be upfront that this loan was actually under the threshold of the $1 million threshold, because our share is only 800,000, but when you combine it with the other three loans they have, it equals about 2.8 million or something like that, exact number. So anyhow, he brought it to us. First Interstate would be going in on it. We would have first position at 800,000, and then there'd be an SBA portion, which would have the second position. The committee did vote to approve that loan. It does not need to go before the whole board, but I just wanted to report on that. The second item we had was, Doug also talked about the Veterans Home Loan Policy that the board has. And in reality, the Board of Housing, by statute, is responsible for direction and management of the Veterans Home Loan Program. So they have authority to adopt rules, terms, and conditions. We had our own policy, and it really didn't make any sense to us, and the board's sole responsibility in my mind was just to purchase the loans from the Board of Housing. So as a committee, we voted to eliminate this Board of Investment policy, and I will need a motion for that. I would move that we eliminate that policy.
second.
I think the whole board was there, right, Mark? So
Yeah, but I think we need to vote on it on the record, and are there any other questions?
I didn't know if
The
there was
idea being that they were duplicative, and apparently sometimes conflicting, and so it's clear that the Board of Housing has the authority in this issue, so it makes more sense to repeal our policy. So, no, seeing no further discussion, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Thanks, Maggie.
Okay, we also had an update on the, we have some property, it's on the border property that was in, they were in default on a loan. And according to Doug, we have received an offer to buy that property, and hopefully we'll be bringing that back at a future meeting. And then Louise Welsh updated us on 8 potential intercap loan applications that have come in. 7 of those would only need staff approval, and 1 of them would come back to the committee. And I want to give an update, the current rates on intercap loans is 3.15 after the first week. Good. I think that's really all we have at the committee, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Any questions about the loan committee? All right, next we go to TRS, ERS members. Who wants to be first? Yeah.
I'm first because I don't have anything new to report, but I haven't already reported to this committee.
Well, that you can't get away with that. All right.
And I'm going to give you the same report because we will meet next week, and our meetings are always messed up here, so
Okay. Nothing urgent that we need to know about?
nothing.
All right. Next is board liaisons. Scott, do you have anything for us?
Not much. The only thing I would say is it looks like revenue is picking up a little bit, and if the trend holds, then it should hit the forecast that the legislature passed in the previous session. So that's good news.
That is good.
And Friday, we made our transfer as required by law for the transfer to the fire fund, so that happened on Friday. Bill said, I'll count it before April 1st.
Okay. Thanks, Scott. Any other questions about that? All right, seeing none. Let's go to executive director reports.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're now on tab 2. So, following the standard memo format, I was urged to provide a little more time for committee meetings. I think we succeeded today. Item 2 is the monthly snapshot.
Finished early as a result.
Whatever.
Only because I was chair, and if Jack would have been here, we would have done that.
We want to take absolute notes to credit everybody that got their meetings on time, a new trend. You see a monthly snapshot. That goes out to monthly, but we always put it in the board packet. So number 3 is the update to the audit committee, which I did. And John has reviewed what staff reported to the audit committee. I think all the board is there. But any comments or questions on the audit update on our plans? 4, custodial banking relationship, C memorandum. I'm going to assume that you've read it. I want to remind you that the idea of the work plan that we've had now, we're now in our 7th or 8th years, is within at least once every 24 months, we try to get any aspect of any importance in the board mission or operations in front of you. So this is a memorandum that we crafted some time ago. It's been updated. The custodial bank is an incredibly important partner with the board investments. It's the agency that holds in custody most of the investments, most of the securities. The big exception is that the private equity are actual private contracts, so it's a little less tangible. It's a contract. We have those contracts here. But as far as negotiable securities, those are held in custody through State Street Bank. So and we have comments from RBK. I remind you that RBK, it's a large shop. They have staff who are committed strictly to the whole custodial bank space. It is an evolving space. It's a complicated space. The custodial bank services as transfer agent, custodial agent, securities lending, securities litigation. We have a very close working relationship with State Street. It's now in it's in its 3rd decade. They were just here last week for a whole day. It's always a work in progress. There's always things to tune up, taking new advantages of technology. So before the staff finishes prepared remarks, RBK, do you have any comments you want to make about custodial banking to the board? This is our once every 24-month review of this.
No, I would just say that Jonathan leads a team, as you know, at RBK that works on what we call investment operations, custody banks being sitting at the nexus between your investment decisions and the work of your implementers, like your internal management and your external managers, and the back office, essentially, that keeps not only custody of all your negotiable instruments. I mean, it's as David said, it's an incredibly important thing because those are negotiable instruments and they have to be kept safe. And so neither RBK nor your managers ever actually possess these certificates. They're held for you by your custody bank. And the range of services and interactions with your accounting staff is daily and a multitude, as they are with us too, in terms of doing performance reporting and monitoring the portfolio for you and then presenting those results that we do each quarter. The custody bank arena has become highly concentrated because it's become a scale business, but it has also become more complex internally because the types of instruments, as those of you who sat on the board for a long time, have exploded in terms of the various types of investments that are possible. So they've been challenged to keep up essentially with the capital markets and the innovations that have taken place. We feel very confident that we have a good handle on the custodial market, and Jonathan and his team have worked with David and your folks now for a number of years on this periodically. So the other thing I would mention, David did not mention currency trading, a very important part of what custody banks do for many clients as well, and one that has been a very sensitive issue over the past 4 or 5 years.
Well, controversial. There's some litigation involved. I'd like to give Joe a comment, and then I'd like to remind that Mike Pettit is now operations manager for us. In that, he's the head of that. He was with State Street for many years. We're delighted he's on board, so he gives us a lot of expertise that we didn't have before. So Joe or Mike, do you have any comments that you want to make in this space of custodial banking?
I don't, beyond what's already in the memo and what you and and Jim had said.
Okay. Michael, was there anything you want to say anything about custodial bank space to the board?
I think what Harvey Coons and what's in the memos is correct. It's a highly concentrated space. There's probably 4 or 5 providers over the years, and I think as a client, we're actually a pretty complex client of State Street. They do a very good job. There's bi-weekly calls we have with them that run the gamut of all the issues across the county and operations, everything, so we stay very much in contact with them on a day-to-day basis and then sometimes, you know, hourly basis. So it's a very important relationship like this.
The dollar transfer, the dollar transaction is pretty staggering. It's 40 to 60 billion dollars of transactions. It's between 50 and 75,000 actual transactions a year. You know, every one of those has got to get trued up, and there are, you know, to have a fail, it's common to have fails, you know, failed trade. There's all kinds of, you know, 99% of it goes through flawlessly, but the 1%, when you overlay it with how many dollars in transactions, there's always something to work out. And then of course technology and safekeeping, it's evolving. The barrier to entry from our perspective is very high. When Mike says there are 3 or 4, we're talking like 3 or 4 on the planet, right, Jim? We're only talking like 3 or 4 on the planet. I mean, State Street and Mellon and Northern, you know, that's about JP is kind of exiting the business. You know, when you look at State Street as far as, it has their fingers on about, what, $25 trillion of assets in one way or another. So we want to bring it to your attention. We don't really expect you to get into the weeds or the bowels of this. We want to let you know that your staff has to, and that we want to at least report to you on the basic phenomenon of what it is to be custodial bank, because it is a huge deal. It is just a huge deal.
David, as I was reading the RBK memo, it sort of synthesizes to a point where this is such an important relationship we have with this institution, and it seems like it's kind of as good for us as the people State Street has interacting with us. And I know in the past we've had some issues, and I think those are resolved, but I guess I want to ask, I noticed there's, you know, huge churn. So do we have new people all the time, or how are we, what's happening with all of this?
Well, I'm very supportive of State Street, and I have been used as a reference a couple of times. And they know that I'm going to be very honest with people, and when people, other states call me, I'll let them know that one of the issues is turnover. And you need to be mindful of that. And State Street employs 30,000 people, and so it's really not for us to say people can't advance and move up and people move out. So turnover is an issue. State Street has a deep bench. They also know that we're not silent about it. They know we're sensitive about it. And we do complain, and we have complained in the past. We're not currently complaining about it, but that prospect is there. I think that what we have an obligation to do is to remain very current and very timely as to what the working team is. It's a big team, and so that we see what the developments are, and so that we're not particularly surprised that they have deep enough bench. But it is probably the most common pinch point we have is turnover with State Street. It is the most common pinch point. I would acknowledge that.
So I would add to that there are probably 2 reasons why, in our experience, institutional investors like yourselves have taken the pains, and I emphasize the pains of withdrawing the many touch points and connections that one has with their custody bank and moving to another one. One is fees, but the other goes to the thing that David mentioned earlier, the 1% of things that go wrong. And it's your relationship team and their ability to problem solve when something goes wrong that is the other sore point with institutional investors. A bad relationship team that can't problem solve quickly and accurately is an incredibly, a sore point with institutional investors, because it's not easy to change custody banks. It's a big deal. And in fact, for the first time ever in my experience, we've been hired by one of the 5 largest pension systems, the state pension systems in the country, on a retainer basis to actually sit with their internal staff and their custody bank on a periodic basis, on a retainer basis, ongoing, that's separate from any other relationship we have with that entity. So that tells you, as David said, the growing importance of the handful of powerful custody banks to institutional investors, that now it's actually a kind of standalone business, even for consultants like ourselves.
I think one of the things that we brought, and maybe just a conceit of mine, but I like to feel like we have a relationship where it's sort of adult to adult, that they can be honest with us, and we're going to be very frank with them. And so that relationship was strong enough that we risked converting to eliminating those pension pools and having CAP. If we'd had a troubled relationship with State Street, if we thought execution was truly something that could be possible, we would have never pursued with CAP. But we had, to your face, State Street promised they could deliver. I believe that we got that done. So I think it's a strong relationship. But they know, and of course when they executed it, we made sure that everybody to their chair of their board knew that we thanked them. I mean, people like recognition. Those intangibles are important. So it's quite a personal relationship with State Street, and we have a lot of people in our audience that work at State Street daily or weekly. But there are bumps, there are issues. They would like more income, they would like more income from us. They may have services we may or may not use, but in the main, it's been a very satisfactory, it's a very, very complicated relationship. And under the law, we have to go out for procurement every 7 years.
What are we in the cycle now?
Jerry, help me with where we
We're
are.
in the 3rd year of a 7-year.
Okay.
I remember when we did that, it seemed
Yeah.
like it was yesterday.
Well, it does seem like it's yesterday because it's such a big deal. So with those comments, anything about it, John?
I would just add, any large organization, you're going to have turnover of people, and people are important, but this issue is less of an issue today than it was a year or 2 or 3 years ago. So part of the turnover is promotions, right? And that means the people that are serving us are doing a good job. And part of those promotions have been to a different role in the same team that services us. And so that's been a positive as the team gets more strength and depth. And part of it has been to more senior positions within State Street, which also I think benefits us because they know Montana well and our history and what we're trying to do, and they're becoming more senior people in the organization. So I would say the turnover trend has been positive, and it today is not an issue.
One other question, in your concluding paragraph, Jim or RVK, you say the presence of inefficient custom process maintenance is another potential weakness for State Street. What does that mean?
Well, that goes back to the 1%. These are, if you look at, as David said, these custody banks, because of the consolidation over time, now safekeep and account for and are the book of record, the book of accounting record for trillions of assets. And so just as that puts us, the explosion of instruments puts a strain on the relationship connection between you two. It also puts a strain on the technology processing and the protocols for pricing securities that may be exotic. And there are many differences of opinion about how an exotic security should be valued. And so the problems that arise related to that last paragraph relate to essentially the accounting machine's processing of literally millions and millions of transactions, and whether it produces 1% or 0.5%. When I used to work on Wall Street, I worked for a firm that had something like 3 million individual customers, And the whole issue was how tiny could we push down the error rate on accounts to 0.5%, 1/4%, 0.1%, and it makes a huge difference in terms of your relationship and your service. So, that's something that all the custody banks struggle with as they get bigger, and the number of instruments and sometimes their exotic nature get bigger, broader.
I apologize to the accounting staff. I should have recognized Julie. Julie, would you like to add anything, you or your staff, about, they're the day keepers of what we're doing, to comments about custody
Well, I think the
banking?
importance to us is we are in daily communication. Some of our staff is talking to State Street multiple times a day. For us, when they do have a change of personnel, it affects us greatly. We greatly appreciate State Street when they have more depth in their lineup. Some of the tools that have helped us, I think, is we have those bi-weekly meetings that Mike mentioned. We have these triennial meetings that they're here for a day and a half. Part of the full day session is talking about some of the best practices or some of the new technologies or some of the directions that either State Street or the board is moving to. But they also take an opportunity, usually in these triennials, to sit with our individual staff and work through problems, and that's very helpful. But the more communication we have with State Street, the better it is for us.
Thank you, Jim. So this is once every 2 years, this is on the work plan, but it's a daily phenomenon with us. Frank or Paul, any comments that you want to make as far as State Street? That'd be good. Frank, we good? Board? Okay, so moving on. Board's website. So I'm going to repeat what I said about the work plan. The work plan tries to put every item that we believe is material. And so every 2 years I put the board's website. And for 4 years, this item has been a complete bust.
That's cool.
No one ever takes the bait. Does anybody want any comment? I've got a memorandum. I'm not sure that I've ever had a member of the public make a specific comment about the website. It's not perfect. We try to make it as good as it is. I find that navigating our own information can be somewhat challenging for myself. We think we're presenting it as best we can, but I'm going to stop here and see if you have any comments on our website. It's all been internal.
Who does that for us? Who's the person in charge?
Dana, where's Dana?
Savannah has taken over a lot of it in the last couple of years. She's really a whiz, Savannah.
Oh, okay.
But her and I both, are responsible for it.
I would say it's Dana and Jerry. I would say they're the leads, really the principals. Dana's really the leader of the leadership team.
Well, and we have, up in Commerce, they have the
Commerce has
high-tech people. For any real structural changes, they are very helpful.
And Dana Martin Jones.
Well, I was just going to say, we redid this 4 years ago.
Redid the website? Well, with incremental changes.
Yeah, I thought we had a pretty big,
Yeah, there was a whole restructure for all of Commerce with the new templates and the pretty colors.
that was that like 4 years
It
ago?
was a while ago, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon for new administrations to want to have their color overlays with state agencies. So we went from a previous color to the new color and the colors. Right? Jerry?
We did a little more than that. We actually, I want to give credit because Dana, Maria, Savannah, and myself, we reviewed the entire website and had to go in page by page. And we did update it. And within the last year, you may see a familiar site on the homepage, which is this conference room.
Well, Kelsey's a very fine photographer. Thank you for that. Anything on the website? Audit matters went into extensive comments on audit where we are. So that was covered extensively by the audit committee. So, Mr. Chairman, those are my prepared remarks for the board of directors.
Any comments about that? All right. Let's then recess for lunch until 12:45. Okay, let's get started again. You're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it very much. Mike and I will trade off a bit on this presentation. I wanted to start off by just mentioning what we're trying to accomplish today. And what we would hope that you would take away from this. The first thing is that we want to convince you that asset allocation is the single most important investment decision that you make. Emphasis on the investment. Governance is even more important, but this board has such a tremendously positive track record on governance that we can put that aside, and we're focused on investments anyway today. The second thing is that we wanted to explain why asset allocation is maybe the most difficult decision you make. And it's not just because it's important. We'll talk a little bit about why it's difficult, and it relates to human decision making. The third thing we want to do from an educational point of view is describe how asset allocation works. What are its prerequisites, what are the tools that are used, and what are the outputs that come out of it, and what are their strengths and weaknesses. Something that we visited with this board on multiple occasions in past years, but it's always worth addressing them again, both to refresh people's memory, but also because you have new board members. And the last thing we want to do is that we want to outline the implications that asset allocation currently poses for the board. And by the way, you're not unique in this. These are the same implications that it poses for all institutional investors. So with that, if we could turn to page 2 or slide 2, we wanted to cut to the chase and talk about those implications themselves. When we run using our 2018 capital market assumptions, and we'll talk about what those are, but those are essentially our best estimates of the map of future opportunities in the capital markets. We get a long-term expected return of 6.57% for the portfolio. And we'll talk about how that comes about and some of its other implications in a moment. But 6.5% is lower than we probably have seen for the last 20 years or so. In fact, if you look at page 2, it's even lower by 18 basis points, this is for the total portfolio, than the study we presented to you in late 2017, if I recall correctly. The third thing I wanted to mention is that it stands somewhat at odds with the assumed rate of return for the plans of 7.75, and yes, I understand that that's not this board's decision, but I did want to talk a little bit about the background of that number, or I should say the current context of that number. About 5 years ago, that 7.75 number, when we looked at our survey of about 90 public funds, was pretty much right smack in the middle. There were some at 8%, there were some at 7.5%, few at 7.25%, but 7.75 was very frequently seen in that distribution. Now, all of those numbers have drifted much lower. We now see clusters at 7%, at 7.25%, at 7.75, or 7.5, and 7.75 is now not out of the distribution, but it's toward the top end of the range. And because this is set by a different board, I wanted to say to you that this board should look at that number and interpret it, in our opinion, as a decision by the plan's fiduciaries that are responsible for that number as the appropriate call for contributions, given the present outlook, given their estimate of liabilities. It's not an investment number per se. It's just that it's derived in part from that, but it is essentially the message from the plan to the state, really, because of the funding rules that you operate on, that this is the call for contributions. And 7.75 now, relative to other plans, is basically calling for less contributions than many other plans are calling for. And yes, I realize that in this state, this is a, these are legislated, budgetarily set contributions, but a defined benefit plan and the actuaries that work for your other plans look at this from the perspective of the plan, not from the perspective of precisely how the contributions are decided and financed. So with that, I'll stop there and ask Mike to address page 3.
I thought you just said that 775 was on the upper end, but then it's colored for less contributions than a lot of other plans.
The higher that number, the lower the call for contributions. And it's essentially a signal that less contributions are needed to keep the plan financially healthy and on the road to.
Or, in other words, if you assume that the investments are going to meet that number.
I don't know, I don't participate in
But the 6.5, what I'm trying to say is that I don't follow what you're saying, because 7.75, if it were lowered, that seems to me would require less contributions to make the same.
No, it's just
Here would be higher.
it's just the opposite.
Well, I understand, but it's the difference that I'm looking at. It's the
They move
6.5
they move in different directions. If this number were lowered to, let's say, something extreme, 6%, it would be your actuary would call for a significant increase in contributions over the next 10 years.
I follow what you're saying, because I'm thinking that the actuary determines the contributions as a result of this number, but not vice versa, so I got it.
This number is essentially an expression of the system's expressed need for contributions, is the way an investment consultant looks at it.
I was thinking of it more of as a target than as an expected return, so that's what I was thinking.
Well, and we'll talk a little bit about the implications of the gap between 657 and 775. With later on in the presentation, it doesn't necessarily rule out that you won't earn 775 or even 8 or even 8.5. It just means that the probability of doing so has shrunk significantly because the market has done so well, actually.
Jim, the long-term expected return is based on our current asset allocation with your new capital assumptions?
That's correct. What we did, this is not at the point at which Joe and the senior staff are putting forward recommended changes to the asset allocation, but this provides the background and the context for you to think about that. And we'll give you plenty of context to think about that as we go along. Mike?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As Jim alluded to in this opening section, the topics we're going to cover today support that, and we've kind of gotten broken into 3 general areas. They work together as a tool to support the asset allocation analysis and to provide the board with a way to review the portfolio and to think about where it stands based on our current expectations for long-run returns, risk, and a couple other things. So, as Jim opened with the 6.57 long-term expected return, we're going to cover that and how we build that in the asset allocation study. How we gauge the confidence in that number and those expectations. We're going to look at the Monte Carlo testing process, which helps guide that. And then lastly, a lot of what we're talking about and a lot of the assumptions that we're making are built on our expectations that we come about through a process called the capital market assumptions process. It's a robust process that we do at the firm to build those underlying expectations which support that 6.57% and long-run expectations. Okay, so I will actually bring it back to Jim to talk about that.
So if we could turn to page 5, and now that we've sort of given you the heads up on where we're heading in this presentation, let's step back for a moment and talk about asset allocation itself. This is something that every institutional investor goes through. And in fact, virtually every individual investor whose money is managed by a professional goes through an asset allocation study as well. So this is standard technique for thinking about investing assets. And what we're trying to do, as it says in the first bullet point, we're trying to find a mixture of stocks and bonds and private equity and real estate, such that for a given level of risk, that combination that produces the highest expected return, everything is expected here because we're living in a world of uncertainty, is what we're looking for. That's kind of the brass ring, if you will. Or you can turn it around and say, we need, or we want to target a particular return of this. How can we do it with the least amount of risk in the combination of asset classes that we use to build our portfolio? Now, we all have to be humble and know that these are all built on capital market assumptions. And then there's uncertainty inherent when these asset classes are combined in these various combinations. So one of the things we use asset allocation for is to check, essentially a recheck on your course, check for any necessary course corrections. And so in the case of Montana, and for many of RVK's clients, we actually do an asset allocation every year. That doesn't mean we change the strategic allocation that's built into the portfolio, but we're looking for things that seem to be emerging as big changes in the outcomes of these that would cause us to pause and say, well, do we need to make a strategic correction? And we'll talk about a few of those. None of them are huge, but that's the purpose of this sort of annual review, or one of the purposes of it. So an asset allocation study is really what we're looking for is trying to find the right combination of these asset classes, and you know them well from looking at your performance reports, to try to get the most out of the assets that you can with the least amount of risk. And when we look at an asset allocation, we always have to base it in where we are today. Not only what your current asset allocation is, and maybe the target that you're heading toward, but we have to look at our best estimate of current valuations for various asset classes, and they differ. Sometimes U.S. equities are very richly valued, whereas emerging market equities are not. We have to look at current bond yields, because those are immutable. Your fixed income professionals will tell you that we can wish you could get more yield from buying bonds, but it is what it is. And the same thing is true in the fixed income world with respect to spreads. There's always a sort of a starting point that you have to have. And when you think about putting these asset classes together, I like to think of it as kind of doing the job of an architect for a house. You're not at the point of choosing marble for the bathroom floor, or what kind of lamps you're going to have, or whatever, but you are laying out the bones of the house, and everything else is going to be hung on those bones. And everything else, in the case of institutional investing, you're going to hang your active-passive split decisions on that set of bones called the asset allocation. You're going to choose mandates. You're going to decide whether you want small cap, more value, more mega cap. You're going to make those decisions and hang them in this structure. The managers you choose externally to execute those mandates, those decisions are going to be hung in this structure. And even your rebalancing policy is going to be operate within the structure that you lay out. That's one of the reasons why it's so important, but it also disciplines, it sets a structural discipline for all those other decisions that you have to make so that they're not made willy-nilly one after another by themselves. The asset allocation that you choose for the fund can be related to the liabilities of the plan, but it's not an analysis of the liabilities of the plan or the benefit structure. That's reserved for a time if you should ever ask us to do another asset liability study, when we will pull from your actuaries for your plans and pull that data and combine it with investment data and assessments of your contribution policy in a study that is what we call the gold standard for the health of a pension plan, both current and prospective. But asset allocation itself is aware of the liabilities, but is not an analysis of them itself. And also there are pragmatic limitations on what you can do with asset liability. For example, if you have very high liquidity demands, you can want a particular asset allocation structure, but the liquidity demands that you have might prevent you from actually executing it. Another is you might want a 25% allocation to private equity, but the pacing and actual work that would have to be done to execute such a very large allocation might be beyond either the resources or the timetable that the plan has. So an asset allocation study is statistical in nature, and you have to apply on top of it some pragmatic considerations as well. So if we turn to page 6 for a moment, we promised that we would have as one of our objectives trying to convince you that this was really an important decision. And there have been a number of studies over time where they've looked at literally hundreds of portfolios and asked the following question: how much of the return of this portfolio can we explain with only looking at their asset allocation, not looking at their mandates inside the asset classes, and not looking at the managers? And the answer is, repeatedly, it's 90% or more of the return is driven by this choice and this choice alone. And so you've heard us say that, and you've heard Joe say that in the past, we have a new tool at RVK that we use with some funds, what we call total fund attribution, and every single time we apply it to a client's portfolio, it reemphasizes that asset allocation, more than anything else, will determine what level of return that you get. And by the way, it also drives the amount of risk that you have, more so than any manager selection that you might make or anything else. So, but I also promised that we would talk a little bit about why it's so difficult. In all of the other decisions that you make, and I suspect the reason that all of you have been very successful in your other careers is that you've been able to look at choices, and those choices have been associated with people who execute them or who make commitments to you or whatever, and you are, by the fact that you've been successful, whether you're a banker like Jack, or you're in John's profession, or you're an attorney, part of your success is being able to read when people are throwing BS at you, or they're untrustworthy, or they're not as skilled as they think they are. But the problem with asset allocation decision is there are no people to judge. It's just raw estimates of what's going to happen in the capital markets. There are no people involved. And so the things that have made us successful in many of our own personal lives is just not present here. It fails us. You know, it's one of the things that we demonstrated we're good at in our careers. It's not that we're perfect, but all of you have had great success in that. But in this case, it's just you versus this amorphous marketplace for stocks and bonds and real estate and private equity, and stretching out over the next 10 plus years. So one of the things that have made you so successful as a professional just doesn't work for you here, and doesn't work for us either. It doesn't work for anybody because there are no people involved. So if we turn to page 7, I hope we've left an impression that this is really an important decision that you make. probably the most important investment decision, and that it's a hard one to make because some of the tools that you have to make good decisions aren't relevant here. What tools are available? Well, on page 7, we talk a little bit about mean variance optimization and Monte Carlo analysis. That's geek talk for two things. Mean variance optimization is simply a set of mathematics that allows us to look at lots and lots of different combinations of real estate, stocks, and bonds, literally 10,000 of them, using our assumptions, which we'll get to, about the likely behavior of real estate and private equity, and international equity and domestic equity, and search for combinations that lead us toward that brass ring that I talked about, which is the highest return you can get without taking any more risk than you have to. That's what that tool does. The Monte Carlo analysis, which is named after, yes, Monte Carlo, it's a sad thing because I don't like to mix gambling with investment, but Monte Carlo analysis essentially reminds us that this is not a linear process. It's not like a budgeting process where if you allocate this much money to this budget and you hold people to it, it's very likely that they'll spend pretty much that amount of money. In this particular case, you're trying to estimate what you can expect, both in return and risk, from combinations of these asset classes, but each of the building blocks has its own uncertainty embedded in it, and then when you combine them, it also has its uncertainty, the uncertainty of the combination. So what we would like to do is to say, well, just how big is the spread of possible outcomes from asset allocations that we might look at? If they're all tightly clustered around our expectation, then we're not so worried about it. But if they're spread out, and even if the most likely one is what we expect, but we could get much, much less or much, much more, then we need to know that because it tells us something about the degree of uncertainty we face when we make these decisions. So if you turn to page 8, let's talk a little bit about the mean variance tool. To do that, we have to have some assumptions, which I promise we'll get to, about the likely behavior over the next 10 plus years of each of these building block asset classes. And when we look at those, we're completely trying to get away from any notion of, can we pick better managers, can we pick worse managers, can we combine mandates in a way that's a little bit better or a little bit worse, and just to ask the very simple question, what's the historical data for the asset class itself from a passive point of view? So we use index data wherever it's possible. Sometimes the history of an asset class doesn't have an index, and you know that from past discussions that we've had. And so we have to essentially, in the case of things like private equity and hedge funds, we have to, we can't disaggregate manager skill from the underlying, what we geeks call beta. That's the behavior, the attributes of in the case of private equity, economic ownership of companies. And so, but wherever possible, we try to keep it simple and just say, what does the asset class do in its simplest measure, which is usually an index. The second thing that we do is we try to emphasize the notion of diversification. And we'll talk a little bit about how we force the model to give us more opportunities or more analysis of diversified portfolios than undiversified portfolios when we talk about maxes and mins, when we talk about limits on what we allow the computer to do for us. And the whole notion of asset allocation is very helpful to institutional investors because it keeps reminding us of the benefits of diversification, which sometimes when one asset class is doing so much better than everything else, we tend to sometimes not quite forget, but don't pay enough attention to. It also gives us a tool for continually asking the question, how much risk are we taking and what are we getting for it? because part of the fiduciary obligation that you all have is to protect the assets that have been accumulated over time for the benefit of the beneficiaries of the plan. And so you have to be not only concerned about trying to earn return, but also protect assets as well. But there are many technical problems. No tool is perfect. In this case, when we talk about risk, and there are probably 8 or 10 different kinds of risk, we're talking about volatility of the asset value in the total fund over time. And we're trying to estimate it. In terms of this particular plan, it's actually a risk measure that's more relevant than it is in some other plans. And the reason is that this plan is mature enough and has a particular funded status such that you have negative cash flow. When you think about negative cash flow, you know that you're going to have to, each year, send assets out the door. And so big dips in the asset value means that you're going to be selling securities and sending money out the door at very low valuations. So in this particular case, the fact that this tool uses volatility as its proxy for risk, like I said, there are many other kinds of risks. It's not irrelevant for a plan in this particular situation. The other thing is that, like all computer programs and statistical tools, if you don't apply judgment to it, it looks for very small things and then amplifies them, very small differences. So if you don't put constraints around it, it will find the one thing, if I can be colloquial here, that it likes better than anything else, and it will load the portfolio up with that, which again goes counter to the concept of diversification. So you'll see when Mike talks about the output for asset allocation, you'll see the constraints that we apply. So on page 9, the only point I want to make here is that brass ring that we're talking about.
Excuse me, Jim.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. And I ask this question every year we have this. Could you?
I better answer it better than I did last time.
No, you always answer it very well. This is kind of for the benefit of newer board members. 2008, 2009, MBO came in for a lot of criticism. And could you elaborate on what that was? And I remember we, the board, and URBK came up with some, what did we call them, add-ons or bumpers?
Bolt-ons.
Bolt-ons.
Boy, you have a great memory.
No, I don't.
That's phenomenal that you remember that. Yeah, so let's talk about 2008, 2009, the great financial crisis was a very unusual event and very traumatic, obviously, but it was very unusual too. And it did result in a whole slew of claims that mean variance optimization and this whole process didn't work anymore. Interestingly enough, here we stand 10 years later, no one has proposed a different model because really no one has come up with one. And the problems that were encountered in the great financial crisis were, one, unique to the situation, punishing but unique, and the other did show a flaw in the mean variance optimization process. The thing that happened that was unusual in the great financial crisis was that with the exception of government bonds, government fixed income, treasuries, everything went down. And you'll see on page 8, you'll see shortcomings at the top. It says correlations are treated as static rather than dynamic. And what happened during that period, unlike what happened in 2000 to 2002, the telecom crisis, the telecom bubble bursting, is that both stocks and bonds went down, with the exception of treasuries. And that was extremely unusual. It doesn't happen very often. It doesn't happen very often at all. In fact, I'm not even sure that it happened during the Great Depression. I would have to go back and do some serious research about that. So that was something that was unique to the situation. But what was an aspect, a problem that mean variance optimization didn't point out is what I call the Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford problem. And that is that Mean variance optimization assumes that you can buy and sell everything. It's all liquid. When in fact, that's not true. And you know it, but we've discussed that with you in past times, in past board meetings. And so for those portfolios that thought they had great asset allocations in terms of return for risk, they ran into both a problem with respect to the uniqueness of what happened in the great financial crisis, the fact that correlations for stocks and bonds, and real estate too for that matter, all coalesced until they were behaving almost identically. And so diversification disappeared temporarily, and I would emphasize temporarily. And then the other one is that their asset allocation didn't give them any clues as to the problem that they might have if they had lots of illiquidity in the portfolio. And so one of the bolt-ons that we did at that time and have adhered to since is that we never do an asset allocation where we don't look at the illiquidity or liquidity of the portfolio as well. So it essentially is bolted onto our process. And we do the same thing, by the way, when we do our Monte Carlos. We actually try to stress to look for how deep the downside risk would be if something like situationally happened in the great financial crisis, that stocks and bonds move together. We move everything to a correlation temporarily at 1 and ask how deep could the portfolio go. So those are some of the changes that we made in our process that we continue to, 10 years later, use every time we do one of these. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. And it is interesting that nothing else has evolved in MVO over the years.
No, and even the, and I get really deep into geekdom here, there's something called risk parity, which uses MVO, but just uses it optimizes off a different metric than the ones that are used typically in MVO. And someday, if your senior investment staff ever gets interested in it and would like, and you would like a presentation on it, we'd be happy to do it. But no, there had been none that had been developed. We also have added something that to help boards make better intuitive decisions. And that is that we've adopted at every asset allocation, we have something. We have the numbers, the quantitative output, which for us speaks loudly, but for some board members, they want to know a little bit more thematically about, well, what is the nature of this particular proposed asset allocation? We call it thematic analysis, and Mike will talk a little bit about that because it's in every output that we do today as well. It's another change that we made 10 years ago. With respect to the two things about page 9 that I just wanted to mention were we can actually use the tool to express where, hypothetically, the portfolios that are combinations of these asset classes meet the strict test of what we call the efficiency. And that is that it's the brass ring. Can't find a portfolio that has this return that doesn't have at least a little bit more risk. Or we can't find a portfolio that has this level of risk but has any more return than this portfolio. And we'll display that both numerically and graphically when we get to it. The other thing that I mentioned before is sometimes we put guardrails around what we allow this tool to do. We don't allow this tool, for example, to ever show us a portfolio, regardless of what the assumptions say, that has, for example, 0 U.S. equity. I use an extreme example. We can't imagine a portfolio that would have 0 U.S. equity, and it could only happen if it were a statistical quirk in the way that capital market assumptions were combined by this tool. And so we're simply not going to allow it. In order to make sure that when we put these guardrails in, that we're not being foolish in putting them in too tight, we will often run what we call an unconstrained model where there are no guardrails, and then we gradually move the constraints in until we think they represent sort of common sense, but we also know what they've excluded from that because we started without any guardrails at all. So, Mike, I think you're going to talk about page 10, and you're going to fulfill all the promises I made about showing the brass ring and also some of the bolt-ons that John asked us about.
Perfect. Yeah, so what I'm going to try to do with the table on page 10 and the table on, and the graphical on page 11 is I'm going to try to tie in everything that Jim just went through, from efficient frontier discussion to constraints to some of the thematic things. There's a lot of information here, so feel free to interrupt me if there's a point that doesn't make sense or if you need clarification on a number, because it can be very easy to get lost in this. So first and foremost, though, we'll go back to kind of opening and not burying the lead. If you look in the far right column, what you're going to see is Montana Board of Investment target allocation. Okay, these are in percentage, so 35% broad U.S. equity, 18% international, and so on. They might look a little bit different than what's actually in the IPS, just on the margin here and there, because we have to work a little bit with the model, but by and large, this is a good representation, and it's a good cut. If you go straight down that column, you're going to run into that 6.57% return that we've been talking about. That number is generated based on the allocation above, and you don't see them on this page, but our underlying capital market assumptions. And we'll talk a little bit about that further on. So you see the 6.57, and you see the risk metric, the standard deviation, of 13.02. Now, if I take you to the left-hand side of the table, you'll see obviously the asset classes. And then you'll see through the columns labeled 1 through 10. These are what we classify, or the model classifies, as the efficient frontier portfolios. These are the portfolios that provide the highest expected return for the level of risk after the simulation runs and after the mean variance optimization runs.
Now, when he says simulation runs, we're talking about asking the computer to do 10,000 different combinations of these building block asset classes, and find the ones that meet that brass ring test that Mike just talked about.
So let me direct you to page 11, because it's actually a little bit easier to look at the information on 10 in this way, and that is, you'll see the line going across the page from left to right. These are the plots of the expected return and the risk. This is what we classify as the efficient frontier. These portfolios, these 10 portfolios that are reflected in the table line on this graph, like I said, are the expected return and their appropriate risk. You'll notice that the square, the green square, direct linear portfolio 8 is where the Montana Board of Investment plots. That's the 6.57 and the 13.02. I'm going to let Jim is going to address that in a second. The two other things that I would highlight, we talked about constraints a little bit. If you look back on the table on page 10, and there's the second and third column, we have the minimum max. Those are telling the model, don't invest any less than 24% and don't invest any more than 38%, as an example, in broad U.S. equity. Those are going to be a little bit outside of the target. They're probably going to reflect a bit of what we have in the IPS, but we're going to let it run just a tad, just to give us a sense, because this is a tool for the board to use to kind of feel where that optimization comes out if you move it just a tad here and there. But as Jim had suggested earlier, it needs to be constrained by reality.
So these are not our ranges, these are the ones you're putting in.
That is correct. These are the ones, the tool does not at this point in looking at 1 through 10 know anything about Montana.
Okay.
All it knows is our capital market assumptions and the guardrails that we put in. You can't have less than 24% U.S. equity, but don't look at any that would require more than 38%. So what it has done, if you look down at page 11, if you look underneath that green line, there are 10,000 combinations of these asset classes. But for any combination that, say, for example, and let's take portfolio 8, has about 13% in terms of standard deviation, it it ignores all of the ones that produce less than portfolio 8 produces, which is 6.85%. And so all of the other, 9,990 portfolios that didn't hit the required, this is the highest return I can get for that risk, they all lie below here and they are all dismissed. There are no portfolios above the line, by definition. Because if there were, then the test wouldn't have been met. Something above 8 would be a portfolio that supposedly could have 13% risk but earn more than this 6.85%. And the computer, after looking at 10,000 combinations, says that doesn't exist, not with our capital market assumptions. So if you look at page 10, I want to point out, you asked John about the bolt-on. So let's look at the very last row. One of the things we ask in here is, how liquid is this portfolio when we assign liquidity rankings that are 100 for cash, very, very liquid, and 5 for private equity, because it's very illiquid. Not totally illiquid, you can sell private equity, in fact you have on occasion, but it's just not easy. When we look at and then they're weighted by the amount that you have in these asset classes. Actually, we go deeper than these asset classes. We have different liquidity for, say, for example, high yield versus other types of fixed income, for private real estate versus real estate, and so on. And so, so that's one of the things we look at, and essentially we look at that number and interpret it relative to the circumstances that you find yourself in. If you're a relatively immature defined benefit plan, and you have a very low payout ratio, you can tolerate a large amount of illiquidity, maybe ratings down to as low as 60. But if, as in the case of one of our eastern state clients, if you have much more substantial negative outflow, cash flow, your liquidity ranking just can't be that low, because you run the risk of the Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Princeton problem of being caught with your public asset classes diminished greatly in value and having to sell them because you can't sell your illiquid ones. So in the case of your particular plan, 77 is and we look at it versus all the other asset allocations we do, is a pretty liquid portfolio. And you can see that because if you look at portfolio number 1, and you can see how little illiquid investments there are in there, and it has a ranking of 79. So you are not facing a liquidity problem at this point when we look at your asset allocation. When we look at, I mentioned the thematic view of the portfolio. Let's forget all the numbers that are calculated by this tool and just look at that second panel where the rows are titled capital appreciation, capital preservation, alpha, and inflation. What does that mean? Capital appreciation means your growth assets, so your equity and your private equity would be in there. Capital preservation are your stable assets that are unlikely to lose a tremendous amount of value, and your fixed income would be in there. Inflation are those assets that tend to mitigate, their returns tend to be somewhat resistant to inflation. And alpha are those investments that are purely skill-based, where they don't have an underlying what we call beta or reference to a particular asset class. So when you look at your current portfolio, thematically you can see, and you've heard this from us in past presentations, that you have a very capital appreciation portfolio because you have tended to have a significant portion of your assets in equity, which is the economic ownership of companies and their performance, which is variable over time. And that's both in public equity and in private equity. So that's another lens in which you can assess this portfolio in comparison to others as well. Mike, did I miss anything on this
Nope.
on this page? Nope. So let's get back to, let's look at the page 11 and say, what is the reason that your portfolio is not exactly hitting the brass ring? First of all, there are no portfolios that exactly hit the brass ring that are so well constructed that even 10,000 variations can't find one combination that produces more expected return for the expected risk of the portfolio. And yours is reasonably close. There's nothing unusual about that. But if you turn to the next page, to page 12, it explains why that gap exists. The computer and the tool, when using our capital market assumptions, which tend to slightly this year and last year favor international equity from a return point of view, asks the question, it basically says, gee, if I use a little more international equity, I can find a portfolio that's just above your current square. And it's worth discussing. Now, there are trade-offs in terms of that, because remember, you do have to pay your benefits in dollars, not in euros or yen, or the pound. And the second thing is you also have probably more event risk overseas than you have in the US, although maybe in the last 2 months we might change our mind about that. But the point is that here, all the tool knows is that there's a return difference in our assumptions, and so it says, using your assumptions, I can find a portfolio that's a little bit better than yours, than the one you have today.
So Jim, as I looked at the US equity versus international equity, and I don't disagree with that, but if you go to page 23, the capital market assumptions.
Oh boy, somebody's reading ahead.
Well, I was looking at it, and you show the same change 2018 to 2017, that international equity is going down the same amount or you're projecting it, that it's going to be a lower return as domestic equity, but the risk is higher that you're projecting in international equity.
It is,
So how does that
and it's a little complicated, but what the tool looks at is not just the difference in return, but also difference in risk, which can offset that, as you're pointing out, and it also looks at correlation. And correlation, to international equity, while being reasonably well correlated with domestic equity, there is a diversification benefit still by by owning equity in jurisdictions other than the U.S. So the computer's actually looking at three things and not just the return gap. So let's talk about.
I asked Jimmy, I'd like to ask on page 12, to me it's a little counterintuitive that we would be asking questions on fixed income and U.S. equity versus international. I would have thought it would have been equally intuitive. When you look at page 10 on the current portfolio versus 8, which was a 30 basis point difference. 30 basis points is actually a lot of money. It's actually a lot of money. 30 basis points compounded is a lot. And so you look at, well, what are the real differences? And it didn't strike, I wouldn't have been able to figure out that international, the big marker, we've had this conversation before, but I think we have to have it. This shows 50% more private equity. Number 8 shows half as much private equity. You go from 10 to 15. You get fair pickup in yield, but you're 10 points down in liquidity.
But you are correct, David. The reason that the tool is able to find portfolios just above your green square is not just due to the fact that it can find some fixed income composites that where the expected return would be higher, and not just because a little bit more international equity versus U.S. equity could push that up. But you're also correct, and I should have mentioned this, that one of the other key things is that the tool is saying, oh, and by the way, if you pump up the highest returning asset both in our capital market assumptions and in your experience, which is private equity, you can do better as well. Now, keep in mind though that private equity also we assign a fairly high volatility rating too, so.
Although according to your page, volatility goes down with 8. You go from 1302 to 12.97.
That's correct, because look how much equity goes down, public equity. It goes down a lot. And so that's one of the, there are many moving parts here, but you're correct. That is one of the things that, that drives the return up a little bit without driving the risk up as much. I can't give you an attribution, I wish I could, that said this much of that gap is...
the 30 basis points.
Yeah, is due to this or that or another thing. I wish I could break that out for you. But you're correct, that is a significant third adjustment that makes a difference. But I want to stress again that if you look at the asset allocation analyses of 20 or 30 other public funds, not one of them would lie right on the efficient frontier. And it goes back to some of the things that I said before about pragmatic issues in terms of implementation. Going from 10% to 15% in private equity means that Ethan and his crew would have to find an awful lot of transactions to do. And to get there in any reasonable period of time, he would have to find them quite quickly.
Well, can we hear a little more color about the distribution? I mean, this
With that,
30-something basis points, how do we, I think the board wants to know, well, you know, I mean, this is an academic exercise, but there are some clear choices that we've chewed on for a long time. And I've been a modest proponent for increasing private equity, but I mean, it's really not my place to be, you know, I'm not the person to be the table pounder on this, but I point this out in every one of these meetings that private equity has been the best return. You put more mix, it doesn't really hurt volatility, and you know, and I don't have a judgment on what it means to go from a 77 to a 67 on liquidity. You know, I don't have a good sense of, you know, we are net cash need. It runs 3 to 4% a year. You know, I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on making that judgment call. That's why we have everybody else here but me.
Well, but you have the framework of the trade-offs exactly right, David. And when you ask about the distribution of possible outcomes, being humble and saying, you know, we use all these numbers, expected return and expected risk, as if they were stamped, you know, in marble or granite. They're not. There's a big distribution of possibilities around them, and Mike is about to talk about those on page 14.
We are. Okay. So, as Jim just discussed, and as we highlighted back on page 3, you know, we're going to talk about kind of how we gauge our confidence in these expectations and potential outcomes. If we turn to slide 14, this slide actually just does really well if you just almost read it directly off the page. What we have are two graphs. The graph on the left is showing the cumulative probability of hitting that 7.75% return over the next 10 years based on our 2018 assumptions. Okay? Same thing on the right, except for the target is 7% over the next 10 years based on our assumptions. So you'll see on the left, with the current allocation, the probability of hitting that 7.75% is about 34%. On the right, for obvious reasons, a lower target, 7%. Based on our assumptions, you've got an increased probability of hitting it of 41%.
So when you say, you've been saying target assumptions, I'm in behind, I think I'm finally figuring out how these charts work. But what is the current as of 12/2017, that's on page 10 there. That's what, when you say target, you mean we don't have those targets?
Yeah, let me clarify.
Actual, is that based on what our actual percentage
It's actual.
was?
It's actual.
Yeah, okay. So, because we got a range, we don't have.
Yes.
I'm not trying to be critical.
No, poor choice of words on my part.
Okay, I got it.
Okay. This table, did I answer that? Are we okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to jump ahead if there's still a question.
No, we're okay.
But I know this is a little bit cumbersome. So if we take a look at what's on page 14, but we also incorporate what's on page 17. This you have to bend the page a little bit. The table on 17 supports what we're seeing on page 14. And if we take a look at the far right column that we have circled in red, and we go down to the bottom right. The reason, Mr. Chair, that I said targets, because in this system, they label them as targets, so it's just naturally in my mind. But what you'll see is that 7.75% in the bottom left hand. And if you go to the bottom right hand, you'll see where the Montana Board of Investment portfolio lines up when we think about the 7% and the 7.5%. So you'll see the 7% of 41 coincides with the second graph on page 14, and 34% is from the other page, or from the other chart. Now, on that table on 17, what we're simply doing here and what the analysis does, you'll see across the top you have the 10 portfolios, the efficient frontier portfolios that we talked about on the chart. Reading from left to right, at that 7.75% on the bottom left, Portfolio 1 has a 19% probability of hitting 7.75% over the next 10 years. And that makes logical sense. It's a portfolio that has more fixed income assets that are expected to have a lower yield, assets that aren't expected to have the same type of return expectations that, say, equities or international equities might. Going from left to right, those numbers should logically increase.
On page 17.
Yeah, no.
So is it portfolio 1? Probability of hitting.
Well, portfolio 1 is the portfolio from page 14.
That's correct. That's correct. Yep.
Go back.
Yep. That's exactly right. These portfolios that we're talking about, these 10 portfolios on page 17, coincide with the efficient frontier portfolios. Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have clarified that.
And you can see that portfolio 1, as Mike said, is loaded up with 40% fixed income, has a lot less equity, has 6% in cash. So it's a low return portfolio. So there's a very low chance of hitting 7.75%.
Now, I know there's a lot of information bouncing back and forth between tables. Logically, moving from left to right at that 7.75%, portfolio 10 has a 40% chance. And that's largely because the assets that it's investing in or recommending are those higher yielding assets, higher returning, expected returning, thank you. That over the long run, 10 plus years is what we base our assumptions on. Assuming those hold to some degree, you should get a higher probability of hitting that target for that return. I'll stop there. Make sure we can.
I just find it interesting after the last several meetings we've been talking about diversifying strategy that number 10 has 0% of diversifying strategy.
Right. That's because it has to be a high, very high octane portfolio.
Interesting.
Right. So, and if you look between 9 and 10, it goes from really liking that asset, but as soon as it starts to hit those constraints and pushing for higher expected return, it drops that component and picks up something else with a higher expected return.
We essentially force it toward higher returning assets. So what does page 14 mean to you? It doesn't mean that you can't earn 7.75%. In fact, there's a 1 in 3 chance, according to this statistical analysis, that you could do that over the next 10 years, even with our current capital market assumptions. But it isn't, the ideal is 50-50, where you have just as much chance of earning more than 7.75% as you do less. And even portfolio 10, that Mike just pointed out in the table, you could actually run up that curve to and take risk to the right and draw a line down, and on the curve above you can push that probability to 40% by having that very high octane portfolio. And the same thing is true with the probability of reaching 7%. You can push that number to 46%. And I just happened to put those in my chart. It's for portfolio 10, just to give some sense of context. So what does a board of investment, what is the trade-off that you face? You can take on more risk, like in portfolio 10, and raise the probability of achieving 775. Or, in your judgment, you could say, this is not the time to do it. I'd rather essentially take actuarial benchmark risk. Given that, let's assume the 775 is written in stone, never changes. There are times when you may say, the decision that I have to make as a fiduciary that strikes a balance between seeking return and protecting assets, maybe in one environment may say, let's seek return, in another one, and have a very high probability of reaching 775. Or in some circumstances, you may say, I'd rather risk a period of time, which could be as little as a year, it could be a few years, in which essentially I'm taking actuarial benchmark risk. I'm risking that will come in below 775, which won't be good for the system's funding, but it will be good for mitigating downside risk in the portfolio. That's the challenge that you face. And there is no algorithm that says, here's the right answer. We don't have the right answer.
Right now, we're more or less where 8 is with the risk and the return.
Exactly.
Any of the other scenarios.
Well, he was asking a question about 8.
Got it.
So, tell me again about, shortly anyway, or RBK's capital market assumptions. How does, is that based on historical, or is it some kind of, if you already told me, I apologize, I missed it.
Nope. We deliberately gave you the sort of the big takeaways and the trade-offs up front, and we keep referring to these assumptions. We're going to get to them as soon as we talk about page 15. And page 15 basically says a little bit of what I just said to Jeff, which is you face a trade-off here between what kind of risk to take. Risk of not making the 775, even though there's a probability that you could, versus risk to the assets that are accumulated in the fund. Which one at any given point in time do I worry about the most? And so, is this a permanent state of affairs if you look at page 15? No, it's not. These probabilities change all the time, as do our capital market assumptions. And so that trade-off, one of the reasons that you have a policy of revisiting this topic from on a more frequent basis than 10 plus years is that you want a chance to rethink it a little bit. Even if you don't make any changes, there's an opportunity to revisit these probabilities and that trade-off that we're talking about. And so the second bullet point is that your process and your work plan means that you're engaged in re-examining that trade-off all the time, as well as the asset allocation that you have in the portfolio in the fund. And the last is that you're aware of the asset risk versus the actuarial benchmark risk. That this is something that is unique to you and not to the other plans, because you're charged with making that trade-off. So with that, I'll ask Mike to talk a little bit about these mysterious assumptions, which I know several of you have sat through before, and we'll talk a little bit about how they are created and what the trends have been. And I'll be happy to tell you that the trends that you see in our assumptions are reflected across the industry right now. Without exception, I have not run into a single set of assumptions, and I've seen many by asset managers and by other consulting firms. Not one of them is going in a different direction. They're all going in the same direction. They differ from asset class to asset class, and they differ in terms of absolute levels, but they're all trending down. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Mike.
Sure. So obviously, as we've discussed in the previous section, you know, our capital market assumptions drive the asset allocation process. That drive, you know, they support the mean variance optimization, Monte Carlo, etc. So these are critical pieces of information that we use and that the board ultimately uses to guide their decisions. So the next couple pages, we're just going to kind of walk through our process, how we go about it, some of the key things that we think are worth noting, and then also we have a table in here that have our new assumptions, which we've already briefly discussed. So we'll kind of go through it that way. Page 19. Before we even go too far, you know, what are we talking about when we're talking about assumptions, right? And I have a pretty aggressive comment up top that, you know, consistently forecasting exact returns for asset classes is impossible. You know, there's no caveats there. I've yet to see anybody who can do it routinely, you know, every single time. It just doesn't happen.
In fact, you should be very suspicious of anybody who claims they can.
Anybody who says. So, and as an example, we tried to just get a simple graphic to kind of highlight what we mean by this. If you look at the chart, what we've done is we've plotted the actual return of the 10-year S&P 500 returns versus a forecast model based that is a pretty universal model that many analysts use to build out the expectations for equity markets over the next, you know, you can adjust the time periods, but for most purposes it's 10 plus years. And what you can see, the easiest way to read this is to go all the way to the right on the chart. And if you look down back in roughly 2006, analysts based on this fairly straightforward model were suggesting that the S&P 500 return over the next 10 years would be about 4.5%. Well, if we go back and we look at the subsequent 10-year return, it's more about 8%. That's a pretty big difference between what they thought versus what was actualized. And that's all. We try to make it a simple way to say, look, it's impossible to be 100%.
And this chart is a little bit misleading because it looks closer than it really is. As David pointed out, 30 basis points is a big deal, but 350 basis points is a big deal.
Yeah, I think the key is that we can get close. We can get directionally close. We can look at a lot of these factors, and they're going to guide what we think is going to happen. But we're not going to get the timing right. We're not going to get the magnitude right. But we can do pretty well getting the direction. If we turn to page 20, what are the capital market assumptions? We've already talked about this a little bit, so I'll be pretty brief. What we're looking at are these behaviors, what we call behaviors, namely expected risk, expected return, and expected correlation. That's really all there is to this. Now, we're building these through various...
All there is to this?
But
this is a lot. This is hard.
That's what's laying in. So there's a lot of different ways that we go to build expected returns. There's a lot of, you know, different models when you're looking at fixed income or equity or international. There's a lot of different ways to do it. We have a number of models that we use internally to give us good estimates and to, you know, to help assess those estimates. But you know, one of the benefits, and this is probably why we haven't seen a model that's been in competition with MVO, is mean variance optimization is simple in its structure, and it's easy and it's intuitive to follow, and it's based on these type of behaviors that are readily available and we can calculate, and there's a history for them. Okay. I think the key takeaways, namely that, you know, these support the asset allocation process in addition to, you know, the other elements, whether it's thinking through liquidity and thinking through other restraints or other constraints. You know, it's part of the process. These are forward-looking. Our capital market assumptions are forward-looking, but yes, they are based on history. These are forecasts only. And I have this last bullet in here just to highlight that these assumptions are assumptions, and that what's likely or going to win out in the long run is a well-structured and a well-executed fund driven by a board that is attentive. And that's where you're going to get the most return that the market's going to give you over the long run.
Sometime. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm just trying to visualize.
Sure.
forecasts, anything other than just not an arithmetic, but a straightforward result of historical performance. So is the trick to look at historically and group different assets and asset classes and performance of different investments to inform your forecast? Because I mean, theoretically, it was what it's, if you just projected the line straight, I mean, you've got your forecast already.
Right.
I'm
And you
just
know,
trying to get a better feeling for what you put in the mix to figure out how to forecast it.
Sure.
Based on what you.
There's a lot more. There's a lot more. Yes, we do look at history. You should look at history because it's one of the few facts you have.
What else do you have is what I'm trying to get at.
But you have a lot more. Let's take fixed income, for example. If we looked at the history of fixed income since 1981, with many of those years, the steady decline in interest rates, fixed income returns were actually not bad. The problem is that now yields are very, very low, as we've talked about over the last several years. And so that history of that long secular decline in interest rates is misleading as to what likely is going to happen, even if yields don't go up, if they just stay at this level. And so you got to look at history and say, well, the history I'm looking at had a particular pattern, had a particular context. Is it the context that the next 10 plus years are likely to be? We don't think so.
But is that a computer input or is that
No,
personal input?
it's a combination of us judgment, that interest rates aren't going to go negative, for example. And it's also, which there's a little bit of history of that. And the other is straightforward arithmetic. You don't need a computer for it. If, for example, you own a bond and it yields 3.5%, and you own it for 15 years, and you don't think interest rates are going to rise or fall, you're going to earn 3.5%. That's it. One of the best investors in the world, when he's talking about the expected return for fixed income, says, look at today's yield. Today's yield, is what you should expect, absent some other, theme that you have about where interest rates are going to go in the future. So, and there are other models that we look at for equity as well. Like, is the PE for equity and the dividend yield, is the PE exceedingly high relative to the history we observe? And is the dividend yield particularly low relative? Are corporate profit margins very high relative to history? If those are in place, then the history that has produced, call it a number, 8% returns to equity, is likely to be misleading as to what's going to happen to equity that today, in current circumstances, is a high PE, a low dividend yield, and corporate profit margins and profits that are unusually high relative to history.
So what I'm getting at is all those things that you just said, that you make that judgment call, apparently you individuals.
Yeah.
Is someone putting that in a program? That's what I'm trying to get at. The correlation of all those factors seems like it would be programmable. So.
And it's not so much that it's programmable, but yes, there are quantitative models that we use. For example, if PEs are very, very high, let's take a simple example today. If PEs are very, very high relative to history, and we think over the next 10 to 15 years, they're likely to become more like history, well, then we have to ask ourselves, we have actual models that construct paths downward to normalize PEs.
But you're putting that information in. I'm asking if you have a program that asks those questions.
We build them. We build them ourselves. They're not that difficult. What's difficult is there some reason to think that there's a new normal that would last 15 years out? Is there some reason that corporate profits would stay high perpetually? Is it, quote, different this time? And also the speed at which these paths take place. For example, if you take fixed income and you assume that interest rates tomorrow jump 500 basis points, 5%, people would take a terrible licking, including the Board of Investment, in the capital value of their fixed income holdings. But then every dollar they reinvested afterwards would be at 5% greater yields. And so what happens 15 years from now benefits from 14 plus years of being able to reinvest at higher years. Now, a different path is interest rates go up 500 basis points and they go up one step at a time over, say, the first 7 or 8 years. You take smaller capital losses, but the benefit that you end up getting at the end is different because you haven't had those many 14 plus years at an extra 5% yield for newly invested capital. So we look at different paths as well. So the answer is yes, we have a program, and these are all built ourselves, and they're actually all detailed in our, what is it now, 85 page, I used to say 70 page, 85 page white paper on this process. And sometimes multiple models are used, and Joe and his staff have it and have looked at it.
Didn't need to beat that stuff. I did.
No, I beat
It
it
seems
together.
like
I
the pivotal
apologize.
point of course, this what makes you different from the next consulting firm is you have your own group of models, I assume, because if it was simply running a program of history and knowing the proper correlations, you'd all have the same forecast, right? So,
Well, but let me make, oh, I'm sorry, Dave.
Well, I'd like to pivot into, I guess I'd like an opportunity to give my assessment and give Maggie and Jeff my perspective. This will be the last time they're going to hear my perspective. And they actually, I'm not sure that I've heard my perspective before. I'd like to get that on the table. So I'm going to probably capitate what you have because I'm going to exercise my prerogative as director. Page 14 is the most provocative page we do. We do this once a year. And it's always been this, although it's getting more aggravated. And so I think we need to explain to you what is the status quo, why the status quo it is. But I think I want to help you, I want to help arm you with what the status quo is. Because take page 14, what does it say? It says that if the retirement systems are at 775, which they're not. One's at 775, one's at 65. But let's just say it was at 775. There is only a 34% probability of us hitting what we need. And by the way, that's never been close to 50%. When I got here 7 years ago, it was in the low 40s, but it's now 34.
it was 46 when I read it.
46. 7 years and 46. That's a huge degradation. Even at 7%, which has the enormous political problem, if you go to 7%, Scott, you're buying into enormous contributions increases. And so this is a very provocative slide. And so you would like to, I think I should answer for you. Well, David, where are you on the status quo? So let me help. So I think let's round this out a little bit. I'd like to remind you that the event horizon is 10 years. If the actuaries are here, their time horizon is different. So let's take some actual data. Aaron, approximately what is the total return experienced generationally for the retirement system?
It's about 7.7%.
It's all that. And last time we talked, it was all, depending what the market's doing, it's right in there at 7.75. Sometimes it says 7.8 for 25 years worth of return. So point number one is question mark, is the lens too short? Because we don't do 10 years investing, we do sort of perpetual investing. So that's part of the status quo. The second part of the status quo is that both our current CIO and our previous CIO keeps telling us, you know, we have a huge allocation to equities now. That we are equity centric. We're what, right about 70%, Joe, right? I mean, it's a big equity play. And it is true that our net cash need slowly accelerates. It's not slowly staying even, it slowly accelerates. In other words, the momentum is picking up. So, I mean, I think we have a duty to present this slide to you, but we also have some duty to say, well, what does it mean for us? And this is where it gets a little dicey. I don't feel like it's my job to be the tail pounder on saying it's unacceptable. But I think we have to explain, well, what is the status quo? What are the facts? What do we have? What's the risk? But I think you need to understand and appreciate that at least on this model, we're nowhere close. But we may be, as for the status quo, being enough risk with all the considerations of how much risk we're taking and how much cash flow we're going to need. And again, I would remind you that the actuaries have a different lens. They talk in 30-year increments. They don't talk in 10-year increments. And so I wanted to get that on the table because this slide by itself, without other color, you can have all kinds of conclusions about this. Your conclusion might be, should we ramp up private equity? My professional biases is that I would be more comfortable for more private equity. But I would also tell you that others, I'll pick on Cliff. Cliff didn't think we could invest our way out of this. He said, David, you can't really move the dial on returns on the challenges for the pension systems. It's going to be benefits or contributions. So I'm kind of done, but I just wanted to give you my sense of this. I'm comfortable with the status quo. I think the systems remain viable. There are going to be some challenges, but we have lots of challenges in state government. This is not the most severe challenge we have. I expect that we'll see probably some changes in the actual return at some point. That's would be my sense. But every year you're going to be this, and for now, for the next several years, you're going to see this disconnect between where the likelihood and what we're likely to achieve. So those are my provocative comments. It's the last time I'm going to do it, so if I'm doing it full-throated, then there you go.
Thanks.
Do you have a metaphor for that?
I've been trying to keep the metaphors down. I did use the architectural exercise.
I got that one checked off.
But now that you mention it, Mr. Chair, could you turn to page 16? David is exactly right. One of the differences between the way an investment consultant looks at the world and the way an actuary looks at the world, an actuary does have a 40-year plus horizon. Because their view is that, if we're kind of in the right zone for the assumed rate of return, then contributions will be too little sometimes, and they'll be too much sometimes, but over a long time it will smooth out. But our task is a little bit different, and it is exemplified by pointing out, one, the page that David pointed out that I had discussed earlier, that there is this trade-off between protecting the assets currently in the fund and taking actuarial risk that you may not in any given year, and certainly in the years in front of us, may not meet the expectations that are embedded in the call for contributions that the assumed rate of return is. But I want you to look at the two numbers at the upper right-hand corner of page 16. And this is the expression, or a partial expression, of the downside risk of the portfolio in any given year. This is the Jeff, I was talking to you about how much do we protect the assets versus how much do we risk maybe not meeting the return expectations that are embedded in the assumed rate of return. One of the things we would be remiss to fail to point out to you is that the more risk you build into the portfolio in seeking return, the more the chance is that if things go wrong, if you hit a 2000, 2002, or a 2008 or 9, then the downside, particularly if you're equity-centric, can be bigger than you might think. And so those two numbers, by the way, your current number, if I can read it correctly, is down over 28%. But if you took the portfolio 10, which is the most aggressive portfolio, that ramps it up to almost 33% decline. Now that's 450 to almost 500 basis points of difference in where you bottom out. And remember, every time you decline by 1%, you have to earn more than 1% to even just get back to normal, much less to get back on your return path, expected return path. So this is the expression of the other side of that trade-off, that we're always trying to make sure that our clients understand that this is a possibility. Now, this is the first percentile. This is a very rare event, but the 5th percentile is a 1 in 20 chance. And notice that the difference there is almost 400 basis points as well. So, you know, this is just something to keep in mind. This is not an easy decision, and I think the reason that David got full-throated is it's not an easy decision. It's a very tough decision to face. Just as it was a tough decision to ramp up risk in 2009 when all the valuations were very low, but we were all scared out of our minds that maybe things were going to be permanently bad. That's the challenge that we all face. So with that, I'm going to let, and one other thing. Remember that, you know, in all humility, we need to predict absolute levels of expected return, for example, and risk and correlation. But we've done exercises that have said, what if we're wrong? What if we and all those other asset managers and consultants are too pessimistic, and there are ones that are way more pessimistic than we are? What if the numbers are doubled? Does it change the asset allocation? And the answer is no. So long as they all rise in tandem. So that if things are much better than you think, than we all think, you want the portfolio to be able to benefit from better. Because most of the return that you're going to get is driven by, Cliff was right, by the external capital markets and not by cleverness. You want to position yourself to benefit as much as is reasonably possible from whatever happens in those capital markets, or protect yourself from it, depending on which way you look at it. And so what we are more concerned about is, are we too optimistic on equity, maybe, for example, and too pessimistic on fixed income? Because that will change the asset allocation that we recommend to you, and will change the analysis. So that relative accuracy is something that we spend a lot of time on. We call it triangulation, because that can screw up the asset allocation. Whereas getting the numbers too low or too high, if they're all proportionally roughly the same, we're going to end up with the same asset allocation. You're going to be able to extract returns from the market, whatever the market gives you, in the same way, be those numbers high or low. So I'm sorry, you need to complete the capital market assumptions, and let's get to them so that you get those on record.
Well, I think we can do this last piece really quickly. If we just move to page 23, and we'll go between page 23 and 24. 23 are our capital market assumptions for 2018. It's the middle column. We also have 2017, so you can see where the changes are. And quite simply, the way to look at this is there's an awful lot of red over in the changes column. You know, if we turn to page 24, the way that we kind of talk through those red are kind of across these 4 themes. And one is that we just continue to see absolute expectations coming down. You know, equity markets have been fairly rich versus history for a while. We expect those to continue to come down. In fact, you know, 25 basis points for the U.S., international, and private equity, and 50 basis points for emerging markets. You know, we recognize the rich valuations. We think that over the long run they come back a bit. But at the same time, if we look at the capital preservation areas, so kind of the fixed income, we do expect returns to stay, you know, roughly in that 3 1/3, somewhere right around in there ballpark. And then lastly, you know, for other kind of alternative asset classes that we build expectations for, commodities, diversified hedge funds, GTA, etc., those are all still down in the 4%, 5.5% ballpark. So what that picture kind of rounds out is, you know, the expectations for these asset classes are low, where we've adjusted them lower for 2018. We generally expect them to stay that way, you know, through the horizon.
Now, some people, and Mike, we should end with page 27.
Sure.
When you're ready. No, some people ask us over the last 2 months, well, but hasn't the market corrected, and shouldn't you be raising your estimates? And the answer is not yet. Not yet. Those corrections are very modest, even though they are They're certainly exciting and they're heart-pounding some days, but the fundamental valuations that lie behind these have not materially changed at this point.
Right.
But if they do, we'll change with them, because that's part of flexing with the market, as we did in 2000, moving from 2008 to 2009. And as the market rose through 2013, 14, 15, we kept shading down our assumptions, and because of the big burst last year, we made some more material changes. So we're not failing to recognize current market conditions. In fact, quite the opposite. When we see them change materially, you'll hear back from us. So you want to talk about page 27 for a moment?
27. This is a graphical representation that we've had in other presentations, and it's a very solid way to kind of look at what we've been talking about over the last hour and a half. Up top you have the expected return for the asset classes. You get a general feel for the risk on either side of those expected returns as measured by the standard deviation. But what the graph shows, and we plot, are the compounded return, which we might want to spend a couple seconds on, Jim. The expected return at 657, and then also plotting that actuarial rate of return of 775. And this is a pretty good picture to just kind of sit back and kind of process and see how it plays out.
So this picture, the reason I wanted to end with this one is that it shows you that somebody asked the question before, what's the distribution? Here's the distribution. And you notice that tail on the left, I mentioned those numbers of very small probability of losses of 28 to 32%. We had losses in the high 20% in 2008-9 correction. But those are very small probabilities. Most of the distribution centers around, as you would expect, over a 10-year period. The expectation of that's in the central tendency, as statisticians like to talk about it, that's very close to the numbers we've been talking about. The problem is for plan sponsors that the difference between these three lines that you see in the center are not trivial when it comes to the funding costs for the plan. They're not trivial at all. And so it just turns out that this is both a chart that very accurately gives you a visualization of the potential outcomes that you might face. But what it doesn't do is tell you that in the very center, these differences between these lines actually have significant impacts on contribution levels and the costs of the plan, which is why, as David said, this is a good time to sort of think deeply on what it is that you want to do in terms of that, protect the assets balance versus seek as much return as you can get to outfund the plan. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll stop. How about that?
Great. Questions?
Did we achieve any of our objectives?
Great. Great. You had David's help, so. Okay, let's take a 15-minute break or so. Back here, 20 minutes, 25 to. Is it good? Thanks. Okay. Market investments. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, good afternoon. Since the last board meeting, the Public Markets Group hired and funded 2 new public markets equity managers. This followed quite a bit of due diligence, several months of due diligence by Jason and Steve here. So they'll talk about each one of the managers that they had uncovered for us through their due diligence. But first I wanted to draw your attention to a handout you should have with replication and in addition to the memo that was in this board packet. And basically the first page of the memorandum is exactly the same, but the back of the page you should see what was missing from the previous board packet entry there. and it actually enumerates the costs of hiring these two new managers. And typically, as you know, when we move money around in public markets, we hire transition managers, and this time we did not do that. So this wasn't really a transition per se, but we thought we'd write a memo about it, as we typically do, and just kind of inform the board on how these managers were funded. And basically, there were two managers that were funded. One of them was Jacobs Levy. They were a domestic 130/30 long-short manager, and the other was Congress Asset Management, and their domestic mid-cap growth manager. And the first one to talk about as far as funding would be Congress. We funded them with cash rather than going through a transition manager and moving stocks around from different portfolios. And the cash came from the cash component of the asset allocation, and we took advantage of this February sell-off around the 9th, 10th of February to move money from cash at the asset allocation level into domestic equities, and then that money was given to Congress to invest in. And we did that in two tranches, two pieces, new glossary word, and one was on the 9th, and it was the majority of the 80 million, and then they filled out their portfolio that they were managing for us with the rest a few days later. As far as Jacobs Levy is concerned, like I said, they're a domestic partial long short manager, and we wanted to fund them with proceeds coming from the BlackRock MSCI Index Fund, the large cap fund. And as a passive fund, it has several in number, stocks in number, a couple thousand. And so what we looked at, and Mike and I took a look at this, Mike Feder, our Director of Investment Operations, and it turned out that we really wouldn't have an advantage in actually taking stocks from the BlackRock portfolio, putting them in a transition account and trading them, and then giving them to the manager, partly because in these type of portfolios that we were moving to a Jacobs Levy, they have to put shorts on. And in order to do that, the manager would do that themselves, so that kind of took away the advantage of having a transition manager trade the stocks for us from one portfolio to another. So what we decided to do, we looked at the cost, and the cost advantage is about the same. And so if we took money out of the fund in cash, so what we did is we actually redeemed cash out of the BlackRock Index Fund in the amount of 170 million, and that cash went to the Jacob Levy account, and then they traded the stocks themselves and put their longs as well as their shorts on the portfolio. So as it turned out, like I said, it was the cost came in pretty close. If you look at the cost and basis points there on the second page there between the two portfolios, and you can see the commissions and taxes and fees and such were included in this. And the cost to move the money to Jacobs Levy was a little over 2.25 basis points, and Congress was a little bit south of 3 basis points. And that's roughly what we've seen from moving money in those two spaces in domestic equities, as far as Jacobs Levy being a large cap manager and Congress being a mid cap manager, and setting up the portfolios that way. The cost came in pretty much in line with what we've seen through history since we've been funding managers at Public Start.
Randy, this is probably a really dumb question, but who do we pay the commission to?
The commissions for the managers were the commissions that come through the trades that they did. And so the way we have our managers set up is they choose who they trade with. So we didn't particularly, in fact, we didn't at all specifically say we want you to trade with this broker or that broker. They make those decisions once we have them under contract, and then they decided to set up the portfolios themselves. That's why those show up as commissions for the two individual managers. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But they break it out as a commission when they pay.
Yeah, we do see that as commission, and that's how we are able to get this gap. Any other questions on how we funded these two managers? Okay, with that said, I'll turn it over to Steve first, and then Jason to talk about these two managers and the portfolios that we managed that we hired them. to manage those.
Okay, great, great to be with you all again. So we hired as a mid-cap, US mid-cap growth equity manager, Congress Asset Management. Basically a family-owned company out of Boston. The original founder of the company was Al Lagan, and he has since passed away, but his family trust remains in control of the company. He has 8 kids. The 3 that actually are employed by the company have basically majority control of the company. So effectively it remains a closely held family-owned company. What do we like about them? They are a fundamental manager. We talked in our previous meeting a little bit about the differences between fundamental and quantitative type managers. So these are fundamental managers, which means they're looking at the balance sheets, making their own earnings estimates, things of that nature to determine what companies they think are best. I would characterize them as a quality growth manager, which is to say they're not necessarily looking for the absolute cheapest stocks. They're not necessarily looking for a real high growth manager that's going to peter out after a couple of years. They would prefer to find managers that have, companies that have steady, repeatable growth that will go into their portfolio. They are a high conviction portfolio, which I'm defining that as low turnover and relatively small number of holdings, about 40 for this strategy. That's a relatively concentrated portfolio in my view. Lower volatility. We've talked in the past about our general preference among managers for those that offer protection in down markets. These are a very good example of that. Again, their quality bias contributes to that. They have an investment committee for each of the products that they have under management, and the investment committee for this particular strategy is listed down here at the bottom. Todd Solomon is the essentially the PM for the strategy. Technically, he's called the strategy committee chair. When prior to us hiring them, he came out here to visit us in person. The rest of the team here has been met at their offices in Boston by Jason and also Joe have been out there to visit them. So again, that's part of our due diligence process, is making sure that we actually meet the team and are comfortable with them and aren't just talking to them over the phone. Another thing we like about them is they are a pure mid-cap manager. One of the issues we ran into in some cases when we were doing a search for managers here was you'd have managers that would let winners run almost indefinitely. We had at least 1 or 2 managers that we looked at that had what they characterized as a mid-cap growth portfolio that had $100 billion market cap stocks in it, which that isn't really much of a mid-cap in our assessment. So these guys, basically once a stock gets to about $20 billion in market cap, they're looking to move on from it. So they truly are a mid-cap manager and view mid-cap much the same way we do. So that would be my quick overview of them, and certainly would be happy to entertain any questions.
Good. Okay. Seeing none, Jason, go ahead and talk about Jacobs Levy.
Well, we funded Jacobs Levy in March with $170 million. Jacobs Levy was founded by Bruce Jacobs and Kenneth Levy back in 1986. It's a quantitative manager. Steve mentioned the fundamental approach. This is a quantitative manager, and they are managing a domestic large cap 130-30 strategy. And just as a level refresher, 130-30, partial long short. So they can short stocks, which essentially you would think of as betting against the stock. So if you took $100 million, they could short $30 million, and then with that, those proceeds buy extra $30 million of extra long positions. To make sure that was with a few of the newer members, that a little bit of the strategy made some sense there. Some of the things we like about, by Jacobs Levy, a very stable organization, very strong research function. They hire only senior PhD level researchers for the team. An exceptional track record, and one of the things too that we looked at, and in terms of the 130-30 strategy is how it outperformed the long-runway strategy, which further strengthened the thesis that the 130-30 strategy was adding value for what you compared to a long-runway strategy. And to the importance of the strategy to the firm. You see the firm has just short of $8 billion in assets and almost $2 billion in 130-30 domestic large cap strategy. So that was one of the things that we liked about this management. Any questions?
I like this form you guys are doing.
Thank you. You kind of copied private markets. That was the idea.
It is not.
We haven't had this for like 2 years, and I'm just noticing.
No, you're right on. Okay, that's all we have. Thank you.
Good work. Thank you. Policy review.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, we're going to turn to tab 5. First, I'm going to talk about the retirement plans investment policy, and then after I'm done, John and John will come up and talk about several of the policies related more to the fixed income accounts. But before I speak to the memo that's at the beginning of tab 5, I thought Jim, in the presentation that RVK made a quick comment that was spot on in the sense of, yes, asset allocation is the most important investment decision we make, and the governance is also kind of critical. The policy decisions that the board makes is really the intersection of those two. So the policies provide the governance day-to-day model and define kind of the guide rails that we monitor and execute the asset allocation policies. So it is a critical aspect of what we do, what you do and decide upon, and that's why we review it once a year. So in the memo at the beginning of tab 5, just highlight that there are some changes we're recommending this year, and they fall into 2 different groupings. One is more grouping of consistency, and I noted in the memo that literally is switching a few words. Instead of using the words market value, we're switching more to the words net asset value. And day to day, they're so close, but it is important for us to be consistent and precise. And so, in our opinion, important to make this change. Market value, think of that as the value of each of the securities added up, and that would be the market value. Net asset value is that plus any accounts payable or receivable, for trades or other expenses in the account as addition. Usually that last part, the payables and receivables, are a small portion, but it is more descriptive of the entire account and of the numbers that we share with you from State Street on a quarterly basis. So that's why we're evolving to use that. And so many of the changes, when I walk through the guidelines, you'll see market value crossed out and just net asset value. So I'll go through those pretty quickly. There's also on the consistency side, we have 3 private asset classes now: private equity, real estate, and natural resources. And so one of the consistency changes we made there was just to align the guideline words that dealt with leverage, and we just made it more consistent across each of those. Now the amount in leverage in those 3 asset classes differ, so as we go through it, you see the numbers change, but how we describe leverage and those words now are more consistent. So any questions on, and I'll point them out as we go through, but that's what I mean by the consistency changes. In terms of the substance, I'm not going to go through each of these listed in the memo. There's 8 of them. As I go through the actual policies, I'll kind of point them out. Some of them are minor tweaks, and some of them are a little bit more meaningful, but not, in my mind, huge changes. I think they're incremental changes, they're improved changes, and I'll talk about that, why I believe that as we go through. Ultimately, at the end, staff is recommending that you accept and approve all of these changes as an updated and better informed policy to make prudent decisions going forward. So with that, if we turn to the larger document, the red line document, this is the entire investment policy, but you can turn right away to page 10 and skip the first 9 pages, because the first 9 pages form the body of the agreement. We're not suggesting at this time any changes to that. So the first change is on page 10, which is Appendix 1 and the asset allocation ranges. And again, we're not changing any of the ranges. None of these changes that I'll talk about or that I'm recommending today impact the ranges or our actual asset allocation. But it's really in the footnotes to this table. At this point in time, we have footnote number 2, and if you can read through the red lines, it says diversifying strategies will hold no investments until those guidelines for diversifying strategies are approved by the board. Well, we did that in February. So therefore, we no longer need that footnote because that event has occurred, so we're removing it. You'll see some additional words that are added there. CAP shall have no greater than 5% of its net asset value managed by any one external manager using an active investment strategy. So this is important. This is one of the changes that were listed under the 8 changes under substance. Previously, to date, each asset class had some type of guideline that restricted how much a manager could have relative to that asset class. But the reality is we're managing CAP as a diversified portfolio, and we don't want to only focus on just one asset class. We want to focus overall on CAP, and we want to make sure no one manager has too much concentration at the CAP level. So the decision and what we're recommending here is to put the constraint that how much any one manager could have at the CAP level, no more than 5%. And I don't know if you remember last quarter, risk management as part of the quarterly review during the February meeting showed the list of managers, and the highest manager that we had at the time, again, under this definition, external manager using active investment strategies. So the highest ones would be our index manager, so that's not active, or the internal assets that we run and that's not external. So the highest manager concentration that meets this definition would be JP Morgan, which runs a significant U.S. large cap, accounts for us, also manages a significant core real estate position. But if you add those two combined, they're a little bit under 4% of the portfolio right now. So, yes, Mark?
So we don't have that limit anywhere else? This is a newly adopted?
Well, it's really...
By that I mean, we didn't already adopt it. It's not in other language. I just don't remember.
Our approach before, and I'll show it to you when we turn the page to look at U.S. equities, but U.S. equities had a restriction for a manager within U.S. equities.
Okay.
And then international, each asset class has restrictions. So what you'll see is by adding this here, we're going to draw red lines through all of those for each individual asset class and only view it as CAP as a whole, because that is our focus. We don't want to be overly concentrated in the CAP portfolio.
Okay, got it. The other question was, did I miss? It looks like you crossed off the number 2 after diversifying strategies. I'm not finding it anywhere.
It's this one.
Yeah. Footnote without a reference.
That's a 2 and that's the 2.
There's no 2.
So you're saying, oh, the two, where should it be in the
I
table?
got
Bob?
4 ones, but I got no 2.
Yeah, so I guess technically the 2 should be, and we can add it as part of the recommendation, could be in the top table where it says pool, stipend, cap. We should put a 2 as a footnote right after the word cap.
You might want to switch them around to make that 1 and then...
True, maybe that should be 1 because that comes first, and then put the related fixed income. That makes sense as a modification, so if you can assume that those modifications would be part of our recommendation to switch the order of the footnotes.
Thank you.
Yep. So that's important because that's one of the substance, but before I turn to U.S. equities, any question on the thought process by crossing out what we did and adding the manager concentration position? Okay, so if you look at page 11, and I'm going to go through pretty quickly each of these asset classes. So we have quite a few of them, and you'll see, especially as we go through, most of the changes, many of them are in common, and so I will go through pretty quickly. The first one I want to point out, in each of these tables, you'll see at the top a new effective date. So if you accept this recommendation and approve this updated policy, our effective date to move to this will be the beginning of next month. But having said that, if we did it immediately today, we would be within policy. So there's no difference between what we have today and what we're recommending. The current portfolio is within policy. The real reason for that difference, as you'll see when we get to the cash asset class, we're switching the benchmark. And the benchmarks are really looked at on a monthly basis, and so we want to start the changes with the beginning of the month. And just to be consistent, we're doing it for every one of the asset classes. So you'll see that across each asset class. The other 2 things on page 11, these aren't really new things, but it's again under the consistency. The statement domestic equities may utilize public long only and long short strategies. That's not new, that's a change. Jason just talked about how we hired Jacobs Levy as a 130-30 manager. That is a long short. That strategy we've employed in domestic equities for quite a while. But just making it clear, because when we talked about diversifying strategies at the February meeting and had guidelines there, we said that diversifying strategies might include long only, or short strategies. And so it's just helping with the consistency across asset classes to make it clear.
John,
yes.
Well, this is kind of a tangential question, and if it's off base, we can take it up at a different time, but why don't we do short-only strategies?
No, it isn't off base. It's appropriate, and if we do at some point in the future, I don't know the long-term history, but in the nearer term, we haven't employed short-only managers. The reason for that ties into this belief that asset allocation is the most important, and the belief that therefore, if asset allocation, you're really looking at what's called the beta exposures or the market exposures, what you expect that asset class to do, U.S. equities. And so we wouldn't want a meaningful part of short exposures, because then we'd be getting away from our benchmark for U.S. equity. But in diversifying strategy, whose goal isn't just give me the returns of the overall U.S. market, for example, but help me manage the risks into an absolute return, and help reduce the volatility and the downside of the overall portfolio. We may, at some point in the future, not something we're currently working on, but at some point in the future may consider a short-only manager. So no, good question. But flipping the page to page 12, again, just consistency right at the top, switching the word equity to equities, right? So small. But it's under other restrictions, number 1, that comes up the points that mentioned the memo under substance. So previously, we said that the capitalization would be constrained by so much large and mid cap and so much small cap. Well, the reality of that restriction is is really our concern is how much small cap, because small cap tends to be more volatile, more risky. And if we focus on how much small cap we have, then the complement of that within the portfolio is going to be large and mid. So we're switching the restriction, one, to be only small cap focused, and two, instead of putting these numbers in that we might have to update as the benchmark evolves and as the small cap takes up a little bit more of the benchmark or a little bit less of the benchmark, make the restriction relative to the benchmark. So we're proposing to switch the restriction to say that we will not, shall have no greater than 10% relative to the benchmark of small cap equities. So, and that contrasts from our current standpoint that says 8 to 18. So, yes, Mark?
Shouldn't that be plus or minus?
Well, again, the thought there is that small cap has more risk than the large cap, right, and the mid cap. So we could make it plus or
minus. But I'm not sure I understand what it means when it says plus 10%.
I don't understand the plus either.
Plus 10% relative to the benchmark. I don't understand.
So the benchmark itself, which on the previous page, not a change, the benchmark is the MSCI USA Investable Market Index. The benchmark is made up of both large and mid, or what is called MSCI calls their standard portion, and the small cap. So so the benchmark has so many small caps in it already. And that portion changes over time based upon how small caps do relative to large and mid caps. And so when it says relative to the benchmark, the starting point is saying, well, how much does the benchmark have?
Oh, you mean so it's
say the
not more than 10% over the amount of the benchmark?
Correct. Right. So say the benchmark today.
That just wasn't clear to me.
So
plus 10% relative to didn't mean.
So relative to the small cap percentage in the benchmark, does that improve
well,
it?
Just relative. If you mean no greater than 10% more, that's what you mean. I don't care. It doesn't bother me too much if it's clear to everybody else. It just wasn't clear to me.
It wasn't clear to me either.
So yeah, the thought is the plus 10% meant more. Relative meant on top of the percentage that's in the benchmark.
You might think about that language. It's not clear to me. So it just seems to me that you're just saying the benchmark has a percent. You can't go more than 10% over that. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, so maybe, and happy to modify it, I mean, that's why we're doing, maybe we say shall be no greater than
10% over the benchmark.
10% over the small cap percentage in the benchmark.
That's fine. You said, yeah, because now you said small cap twice, which is okay, that's fine, but this,
okay.
My comment is relevant.
Yeah, we can change that. It doesn't change the substance of it, but it makes it clearer. But any questions on the substance of that guideline?
It's just curious right now, approximately what is that benchmark?
It's right in the middle of this range. As of today, assume it's like, 13%.
All right, so that would be
23.
A range 13 to 23%.
Yeah. Or it would say no more than 23.
Right.
Right.
But I'm just trying to equate it back to how it's written here.
Yeah.
So
But other times it could be lower than 13. If at any point in the future it's 10, it would be plus 10 to that. It could be no greater. It should be no greater than 20 at that point.
Right. So as written, then, to the point of the plus minus, you're saying that we have to be at what that benchmark is, or no more than 10% higher. It doesn't say less than.
No, it says it shall be no greater than the benchmark plus 10% higher. Right. So it's saying it will be, say today it's 13%, so plus 10% is 23. Right. It's saying the percentage of small caps within the U.S. equity asset class will be no greater than 23%, but it could be 0.
Right. Oh. Right. So I didn't read it in that, as long as I understand what you mean. To me it meant, here's the number on the benchmark.
Yeah.
and it could be from there up to 10%. Thus, that's why they were both saying the plus or minus.
Yeah,
That would have cleared that up for me too, but.
it's only focusing
All you
on,
really need to say is shall not exceed 10% above the benchmark.
okay, so shall not, so instead of saying shall be no greater, shall not exceed more than 10%
Over the benchmark.
over the, okay.
And
Okay,
when you went relative to, it could go plus or minus in my mind. And then you had the plus, which did confuse me some more. So.
okay, I think we can clarify that,
You can fix it.
but it doesn't
Probably
switch how we're
too much
thinking
time
about
on it already, I'm sorry.
No, it's good. It's important you understand. So maybe moving on, the next few, changes, and unless you have questions, I'm just going to skip over them, switching the word equity to equities and market value to net asset value. But then down where you see the 4 and that's crossed out, if you can read through it, this is where that new restriction that we added at the cap level, why we're crossing out, because the old restriction said, using an active manager by any one manager shall be no greater than 15% of the domestic equity asset class. So instead of having that, we're now using that 5% at the cap level. So it replaces it. So again, through many of these asset classes, the last few guidelines in each asset class you see crossed out because that one we talked about, footnote 2, which will become footnote 1, in the table is now at the cap level. Any questions there? So that would be the changes for U.S. equity. Turning to page 13, going to go through this pretty quickly because it's really similar to speak about non-U.S. equity, it's really similar to U.S. equity. All the changes on page 13 are similar to what I've already talked about, so unless there's no questions, I won't address them. The number 1, other restriction, will make the same adjustments to the language, but it's the same concept. Same words, we'll use the same words that we just talked about.
Number 3 as well.
And in number 3, we'll switch the words there, but I want to spend a minute on that. The reason there is previously, you see we crossed out the word dedicated emerging market and crossed out the word mandates. So the thought process is if we hired a manager only to manage emerging market securities, that would be considered an emerging market equity mandate. And that's what the restriction did before. By making these changes, we're changing, being more precise. We're not looking just at the mandate level. We're looking at the securities through the portfolios and saying, if any of the portfolios holds any emerging market equity exposure, what is that and what does that sum to be? So that's why we crossed out the word dedicated and mandates and added the word securities. So now it's a look-through process. It's finer, it's more risk controlled, looking at the individual securities. But then when we do that, some of the managers that we have that have already an emerging markets and have a broader mandate for both developed markets and emerging markets, that's why the number is switching from 5% to 10%, because today, previously the restriction only dealt with the emerging market mandate. So this benchmark, this change, this change in the wording here to go from a mandate to a security level, I think is better. It improves our management of the emerging market equity exposure, but we will switch the language to be consistent with the first and say doesn't exceed the benchmark more than the 10% amount. The next one, again, is just consistency in item 4, and 5 and 6 are similar to the comment I made before. They're being crossed out because we're treating manager restriction, how much any one manager could have at the cap level. Any questions on non-US equity? So switching to page 15, Schedule C on private equity. No changes on the first page other than effective date. On page 16, we crossed out number 2 because this was the restriction of how much any GP manager could have within private equity. That again will be captured at the cap level. Number 3 here is it. Yes.
On your number 2, second line, you're missing a B. Should be capital, should be considered U.S. exposure.
What are you reading?
This is just an editorial.
Where are you though?
It's page 16, note 2, the second line. Committed capital
should be considered. Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
We strive for perfection here.
So do we, but we can always use some help to get there.
We just want to prove that we're reading it.
That's all good. All good. Thank you. But the change we did make here is the new restriction number 3 that we inserted. No more than 10% of the aggregate of the private equity asset class, net asset value, might be invested in direct co-investments. Okay, that's a mouthful, right? The first important thing to know is up top, we have under the permitted investments that we can make co-investments, right? Okay, what is a co-investment? You know, right now, we have no co-investments, right? We're at 0. But we want the capability as we go forward to consider this. But right now, we're only investing in funds. Each of the funds that we're investing invest in underlying deals, right? From time to time, we're offered an opportunity not only to get that exposure via our investment in the fund, but the GP might offer us an opportunity to co-invest with them and put some dollars, additional dollars, and invest directly in that specific idea. So we're not doing it today. It's 0 exposure today. It's something we're spending a little bit more time looking at. It's permitted by the asset class. But before this change, number 3, it wasn't restricted. And we want to make sure that there is a restriction, and so we're saying no more than 10% is what we do. And as I said, today it's 0. So it's an added restriction. It's any questions about that? What co-investments are? Why we added it? Okay. And then the other 2 are just small consistency changes under private equity. Flipping to natural resources, this is, I know, getting tiring because it's all the same things, but so I'll try to go quicker. But on the top of page 19, we're noting that natural resources asset class could use public long-only and long-short strategies. The majority of the investments in here are private assets. But the benchmark is public, since it's investable, and there are public securities that are natural resource companies. So we just want to be clear that we could invest in them long-only or long-short. At this time, our only long-only exposure is an ETF within, as I talk about it, from real estate and private equity, we have an ETF and those so under other restrictions here, again, number 2 is entirely crossed out because that new cap restriction on a manager. Number 3 is when I said under the memo, under substance changes, there was one saying there were some minor changes, right? Instead of it being no greater than 0.5%, we're switching it to 1%. So it's a minor modification to boost it up to 1. And then I think everything else there we've already talked about on that page. So no real material changes for natural resources until you turn to page 20. On page 20, natural resources, and specifically the timber fund, didn't have this leverage language. This is when I talked about the consistency comment when I was reviewing the memo. we had similar language to this in private equity and real estate. We're just making it part of the natural resources for consistency. But as you look at each of them, if you look down below the paragraph, you'll see the timber fund investment leverage policy range 0 to 30%. That's a lower range than what you'll see in the real estate and private equity. But we wanted to be consistent and acknowledge that leverage is used and be consistent with the language there. So that's why that addition to the guidelines. Any questions about the natural resources guidelines?
I was just saying, showing him, we have a range here, 0 to 30 with the number above us, so you can exceed it for the...
Yeah, and there, we'll see shortly that where we had it before, it's because when you make your first investment, right, and when I should say when the fund makes its first investment, they now have these credit lines that they can draw down upon. And a credit line adds leverage. And so if the way they pay for that first investment is with the credit line, and managers are doing this a little bit more because instead of making investments and calling capital more frequently, they call it more at regular periods of time, and so they use the credit line, then call the capital and pay off the credit line, after 30, 60, or 90 days. And so, but if you assume that they made an investment and they paid for that initial investment with a credit line, you would be exceeding the 30% leverage. Because at that time the fund was just started, we had no dollars in the fund. And so we're saying there are circumstances that it will briefly exceed it, but it's with an intent that the fund itself, for our size of commitment dollars, will maintain a leverage lower than 30%. Does that make, Matt, maybe, how can I try to explain that better?
I'll keep looking at it.
Ethan, can you suggest better wording here? Than my example, or is there another way to state it, or?
I guess maybe the only thing I would say on the margin is managers have been using subscription facilities or credit facilities or for decades. It's a tool, it's an administrative cash management tool that funds employ. It's not just sort of an all of a sudden thing. I put this language, or suggested to Joe that we put this in the policy because it's consistent with the real estate language, and it's a recognition that staff wants consistency across investment policies, particularly with those strategies where we recognize leverage will be employed. And there are, what I would classify as anomalous events to the extent it's very early in the fund investment life cycle where a manager utilizes this line of credit to fund its initial investments before drawing down capital that coincide with a reporting period to us that would skew the numbers to a very, for example, recently, the last, I think it was third quarter, we saw some managers that were 95% leveraged, and that was a big, what's going on? So it immediately forced us to go out to them and say, well, frankly, we immediately went, well, it's early on, it's probably just the subscription line that's skewing the numbers, and of course that's what it was. So we wanted to provide flexibility within the language to account for those very infrequent events, while communicating to you that we're aware of it. It could happen. We want to have flexibility within the policy language to recognize and account for that very infrequent event. So it's just, really, it's our attempt to be very transparent with you all at the end of the day.
It comes back into line with the range.
Correct.
Absolutely.
Correct.
Absolutely.
So, because Jim didn't exceed his limit on analogies, I'll try to offer one. So say a mortgage payment for a house is due on the 1st, right? But if you pay it on the 5th of the month, they don't assume that mortgage is past due, right? And so this is, it's technically, beyond a level, i.e. the first day of the month to pay your mortgage, but it's brought in line with an acceptable, reasonable time period that is consistent with the intent of the amount of leverage. And so that's what we're looking for here. Now I exceeded mine.
No, it's past due, you just don't get a late charge till the 16th.
That's more correct. That's more correct.
Just a note, I think I'm missing a period in the second to last line of the red there.
Okay.
Right after.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Closer to perfection now. And, so moving on to real estate asset class, similar, on page 21, the effective date, and just clarifying that the real estate asset class also could use long only and long short strategies. In page 22, this is one of the changes listed under substance. Previously, number 2 had said no more than 7.5% of the real estate asset class should be in a single partnership, right? Where because we separate the asset class into core, which are the higher quality, less risky type of real estate investments, we're investing in open funds so we have liquidity. We can get in and out with some flexibility. And non-core, which is more like a private investment, we have less liquidity. We're clarifying that our thoughts on that restriction were really for the non-core portion of it. But if you look at the change, it's a substantial change because it no longer applies to the core percentage. But the core aren't being ignored. I mentioned earlier that JP Morgan is one of our core real estate managers. We still would capture them in their concentration because of that cap restriction that we added before, and saying no more than 5% of any one manager across cap. So it is a change, one of them that I list in the memo under substance, but more specific to our intent of the non-core portion of the portfolio. Number 3 is crossed out because we have that new cap restriction. Number 5 that is in red here, this is what I addressed previously about co-investments. It's just an added additional restriction that we're making. And at the bottom of page 22, although we had leverage language before, we're inserting, again for consistency and attempting at greater clarity, is adding the same language, describing when we believe it might be reasonable to do so to exceed kind of that leverage amount temporarily. But it is the same language that we just reviewed in the last asset class. Any questions on real estate? Okay, seeing none. On the next page, next asset class tips, there's really nothing there, just the effective date and switching to net asset value. So I'll turn to broad fixed income. And again, nothing here that we haven't already talked about, the switch to net asset value. I guess number 3, as we talked about under equities, we switched from emerging market debt mandates to emerging market securities. So we're making that change there for consistency purposes and I think improved risk purposes to look at the security level and not the mandate level. And then lastly, number 5, we're crossing out because we made that change at the cap level. Switching to page 28 and U.S. Treasury Agency asset class, it's just updating the words to net asset value. Turning the page 30, investment grade asset class. Here, the real change, the other ones we've already talked about, but the real change is the other restrictions, number 1. And so previously, we said, hey, of these 3 rating agencies, Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, we want to have 2 of them. As we've thought about that more, there's increased, we believe there is some likelihood that at some point, even a highly well-known, highly rated name might be only rated by 1 rating agency. Because remember, these rating agencies are paid by the issuers of these securities. And so particularly if you're a high-quality company, you might be, well, why do I need to pay multiple rating agencies? I'm only going to pay 1 of them. And so because of that, we're making it clear here that if it is 1, but still is rated consistent with the investment grade quality ratings that we have, then we believe that should be acceptable. But if it is rated by multiple rating agencies, our focus is which explains if they're different, that's what split rated means. So if one of them has it rated A and one of them has it rated BBB, our focus is going to be on the lower ratings used. So in that case, we'd use the BBB. So we're being more conservative and saying we're going to look at the lower of the 2 ratings, but we're allowing greater flexibility to recognize that some of these issuers may only utilize 1 rating agency because of cost, whatever.
It says, I'm just a little confused. It says must be rated investment grade by Moody's, S&P, and Fitch. So it's got to be all 3.
It says must be rated investment grade, and defines investment grade by their 3 rating agencies. By Moody's, S&P, or Fitch.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So it should say or Fitch.
Otherwise, the split rated didn't make any sense.
Yeah. Okay. I think that changed. The reason why we said and is we would not, if say 3 of them rated it and 2 of them rated it, Baa3 and BBB minus, and the other one rated it BB, which is a below investment grade rating, we would not buy it, right? And so that's why it said and before. But given this updated language, if we had 3 ratings, right, and we would look at the lowest of those 3 ratings. In that case, if one of them was BB, it would not be allowed. Right. So that's everything else we've already covered. It's just consistently changing. So turning the page 33 on the agency mortgage-backed securities. We've talked about everything here. It's that net asset value update, and it's the change to the cap manager restriction. So if there are no questions, turning the page, same thing, no changes on page 34. Page 35, yes, we're switching to net asset value, but we're switching the numbers from a maximum of 5% to a maximum of 10%. In item 1 here and item 2, and the reason for this is we're looking at emerging market debt securities, not mandates. So to be consistent with what we did on the equity side, we're updating here and we're making 10%. And although some emerging market debt could trade in dollars, we're switching also, number 1, to be in non-US, switching the first restriction outside of US currencies to be in that up to 10% could be in a foreign currency. So it's the consistency between the 2. It's not a big shift. I guess this would allow us a little bit to have more bond exposure that had currencies outside of the US. And some of those would be consistent with some of the recommendations that RBK has made over time and suggested we consider regarding emerging market debt and other types of fixed income. But in our mind, it's not a it's a marginal change to allow a little bit more flexibility and take on a little bit more risk, but is not a significant change.
Joe, these changes from 5 to 10% in these two
Yep.
emerging market debt, if we go back to page 10, that's just they're a subset of high yield? Is that what I'm understanding? In the high yield asset class on the table, we're showing a range of 1 to 5%.
Correct.
So you're saying we could do a 10%
Of high yield.
allocation of the total high yield
Of
asset
high yield.
class.
So
Okay.
of a cap, if high yield is 3%, then the most we would be is 10% of that.
3%.
So it would be 0.3% of
Okay.
cap.
That's what
Yeah.
I just want to make sure.
Yeah. Okay, there's no other changes, then no other questions, turning to page 36 in the cash asset class. Here, the substance change, and John will talk about this a little bit more when they talk about the policy statements on dealing with the other types of accounts, but our recommendation is to switch the benchmark. For quite a while in our cash asset classes, including STIP, we've been using 1 month LIBOR as a benchmark. As well known over the last few years, LIBOR has been manipulated, there have been suits, it's being phased out. So we want to be sooner to make a change here than waiting for down the road when LIBOR actually drops off. So we're just moving it to a well-understood benchmark, which is a Federal Reserve issued benchmark using U.S. Treasury's 1 month index. And I guess it is more conservative because it's only a U.S. Treasury benchmark. So over time, this benchmark would have a little bit less yield than LIBOR. But it's consistent with the liquidity expectation for this cash asset class and for STIP, where you'll see it in a few minutes because we're recommending a change there also. But it is a benchmark that the Federal Reserve offers, so it's not something that we're coming up with ourselves. We're just choosing something that they put out in the marketplace every month. So that's the substance change for the cash asset class. Any questions on that? And then the last asset class, diversifying strategies. Thankfully, there's not a lot of changes here because we just talked about it in February. But to be consistent, we're changing the words market value to net asset value. So there are a number of recommendations. Any changes on any of them, we will incorporate the words to improve the clarity and description of some of the guidelines and update those, but any other questions?
You need a motion for that?
Yes.
So moved. Second?
Second.
Moved and second. More discussion? Okay, all in favor of approval of the changes in the investment policy, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? That carries.
Thanks. So now I'm going to turn it to John and John to cover the next set of policies. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I am on tab 6, and the memo that's on top there refers to the separate account policies, so maybe if we could just skip that for the moment and move to the short-term investment pool policy statements, and I will let Mr. Ramasco lead us through that.
All right, thank you. So the substance of the changes to the policy are on pages 9 and 10. A lot of red there, so I just wanted to outline the theme of what we're asking the board to do, and that is that for systemic risk, or risk that's caused by overall market moves instead of, say, an individual security going bad. We had in here arbitrary, subjective measures, and we wanted to change it to a objective, measurable
measure. And so that is the overall arching theme is we can measure the systemic risk and we want to limit it to no more than the amount of the reserve. Other than that, we're not asking for the ability to extend maturities or go down in credit quality or we're just generally not asking to make changes that would increase risk. Yes, sir.
So we're looking at page 9, number 6, right?
Right.
Walk me through that. I don't understand the terminology because I don't.
Right.
I just don't know the terminology.
So, background to that is that you might recall the last STIP presentation, we gave you a measure of what we think the worst case scenario could.
Was that a defined term in our policy? Worst case scenario? No, I'm serious. I mean, that's something that we.
It is not.
No, but we do define what we call worst case scenario here.
Okay.
What the worst case that we've ever seen was in 2008 when the markets really went bad, and we were able to go back and measure how much the market value of specific asset classes changed. And so we pegged that as the worst that we've ever seen. And we want to use that as a proxy going forward to what we think the worst case scenario would be.
Okay, so that last sentence is the one that I need to understand, right? So when it says the estimated worst case scenario.
So the estimated worst case scenario is a calculation where I'm going to use the term spread duration, and that is a measure of how much the market value of a security changes based on the increase in spread, the amount over and above a treasury, multiplied by the amount of how much it widens.
So days to maturity.
Right, so that's...
Should be divided rather than dividends, shouldn't it?
Yep.
That's part of what was scaring me up, I think. Divided by 365, the percentage of the year in days, right?
Yep.
Multiplied by 2% for security maturity and less than a year, 3.5% rating. Okay. With that change of divided from dividend, I think I did get it.
Okay.
I just wasn't tracking.
So that is a little bit more than that is more than what we saw worst case scenario, but it's a measure that we can. I was going to say can be easily understood, but easily explained, and can be easily measured, and then we can objectively limit our risk to, in this case, to the amount of this STIP reserve.
So is it risk assets may be or will be? Which word is correct?
Good question.
Will.
Okay.
Good catch. Could be either one, I suppose, just say pick one.
Yeah, that's what I say. I don't care, I just need to know. One's a little more flexible.
And the only thing that we were going there is we don't want to be forced sellers. We'll just say, well, okay, if things really go to heck, then going forward, we're not going to be able to buy more risk assets. In other words, we would just be buying treasuries and agencies. A couple of other substantive changes, because Joe mentioned changing the benchmark because of the problems with LIBOR. Those problems just seem to kind of get a little bit worse as we go on, and there's a significant disconnect between LIBOR and the real lending market. for which it was intended to measure. We chose the 1 month maturity. Another common one would have been a 3-month maturity, but we do limit ourselves to 60 days weighted average maturity, so we didn't want to pick a benchmark that would potentially, we could violate another part of the policy statement, so we went with the 1 month. We did eliminate asset-backed securities as a potential type of asset. That's just because in the years John and I have been here, we've never bought one. They're difficult to get a good allocation. It's not an uncommon security by any stretch, but we just don't see the opportunity to buy it, and so we just eliminated that. We are asking for a change. I'm sorry?
What does ABCP stand for? That's the rest of the acronym.
Yeah, so ABCP is asset-backed commercial
Oh, there it is,
paper.
down below.
Yeah.
All these damn acronyms.
We are asking, we had a limit in what was number 16. We can buy, separately, we can buy up to 40% of the portfolio in asset-backed commercial paper. We limited ourselves to 90-day maturity there. We're not asking to change that. What we were asking to change is there was a restriction where we said of the 40%, no more than 10% can be greater than 60 days. When we look back at worst case scenarios, I wasn't able to appreciate any difference between 60 and 90-day commercial paper. There are cases when we think, well, rates are, particularly after the Fed moves, rates are good for a while. We would like to put on a little more weighted average life. That's the easiest place to do it. So we felt like it would be reasonable to eliminate that restriction. That is
John, do you in STIF require 2 rating agencies, or are you just one, like you just switched the other policy?
Yeah, so two ratings, and if there were 3 ratings, you couldn't have a 2 in there. You couldn't be A1, P1, F2, for instance.
Oh, okay, okay. But you do require 2, not just 1?
Yes.
Okay. And
you believe that?
Yes.
Yep. Confirmation.
Because we changed the policy before, why do we still have 2 in this one and only 1 in the one before?
That's my question.
I speak John.
Oh. So, I'm sorry, John, you're referencing...
Well, in the policy Joel was just putting us through.
Okay.
Wherever it was, we switched from requiring 2 rating agency certifications to 1 for securities.
Right. So, I guess the theme I would say there, John, was that I didn't want to at least in this I didn't want to change any of the restrictions that were aimed at an individual security, only at the market overall.
Okay.
And so those ratings are obviously aimed at an individual security. And I think there's still benefit to the 2 ratings.
So I think to me that for STIP, recall the mantra here is more safety first,
right.
Liquidity second, return third. So it's kind of a different mindset than when we're talking about the other portfolios. And the other thing I would mention about the cap portfolios or just generally internal portfolios, when Joe and I were talking about it earlier, there are some securities within the benchmark that have only 1 rating potentially. And the other thing that came to mind was when we were in the crisis situation, you saw a number of companies that were dropping ratings, partly because the rating agencies were kind of going a little nuts and just downgrading everybody. And so you had more situations where, say Moody's took them below investment grade, they just dropped the Moody's rating, and maybe Fitch and S&P were above, or maybe it was just S&P at that point. So just don't want to be a forced seller in that situation. If internally you feel that it's still good credit.
So I think that is it for substantive changes.
I don't know if you want to vote on these one at a
You
time.
want to do them separately? Might as well. Yeah. Let's do a motion on the recommended changes for the statement.
I would move adoption of the recommended changes to the STIP investment pool.
I second.
Discussion?
That, of course, is with the input that you gave.
What's the agreed linguistic, right? And edits, none of which was substantive.
Divide, dividend, very.
Well, that could be separate, which is clearly a typo. Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Not clearly enough, or I would have called it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moving on to the trust funds investment policy. I don't have a red line here because this is kind of a wholesale change to the new format, which should hopefully look very familiar to you, but we've managed to turn the former three-page document into a 14-page document. So we got that going for us. But the format, the boilerplate here, the first, call it 7 pages, is essentially very similar to CAP, just the trust fund in there as a substitute. So I won't go through the specifics there, but if there's any questions or anybody sees any other errors or anything, I'm happy to address that. Really, at the end of the day, we're not asking for any major change to the guidelines or how we manage this pool currently with current guidelines, but just updating the format there with the new Appendix 1 with the allocation ranges. The allocation ranges have not changed. For real estate, high yield, or the investment grade fixed income and cash, those all stay the same. But just breaking that out a little bit differently. And we would be in compliance with this policy on adoption. Again, no changes to really anything that we're doing now, but happy to address any questions you might have about this change.
Good.
We should be able to find something.
One minor formatting thing.
Oh, yeah, maybe.
On page 7, you'd be part of the indent, but I'm not sure why. Just minor kind of.
Where are you?
It's not a word, you'll catch, it's just a formatting.
What?
Very minor on page 7.
Okay.
I'm a little OCD and I apologize.
It's all right. Probably just my inability to run words.
Oh, I see. So we need to vote on that, is that what you're telling me?
Yes, please.
John?
I will move that we adopt the trust fund investment pool investment policy as presented.
Second?
With format.
The format changes. Second. All right. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no, that carries. Now you may proceed. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay, so then the last 6 policies here is kind of back to the memo that's at the beginning. This is very similar to what we have brought to you the last several meetings. We've got 6 additional separate accounts here. We are not making really any changes that would affect how we're managing these accounts. We're just kind of moving to the new format here, clarifying. Really just the same ranges. I guess the major change was, I believe there were 2 or 3 of them where we kind of removed the option to invest in individual corporate securities. We've talked about that in the past. None of these are currently invested in individual corporate securities, and I don't believe they have been for some time. But as we've talked about, for reasons of diversification and liquidity, we think it makes a lot more sense to be invested in the trust fund pool instead. That's what that is there for. So with that said, happy to take any questions on any of those policy statements as well.
I think it's on easy.
I had a text, so we're on the trust fund investment pool changes, right?
We're on the separate account, individual separate account policy changes, starting with the Clarksville Site Response Action Fund, I think was the first one there.
And there's no, are those all, I'm sorry, I missed it, are all those new?
They are, none of them are new. We're just moving to the new format, and really no substantial change to how we invest those currently, but updating that to kind of give it a new format and make it clear that we aren't going to invest in individual corporate securities and securities.
You need to vote on those two? You want to vote on those? All right. John, you man?
I do. I would move that we adopt the policy statements for the 6 items listed on the memo.
Second? Second. All right. Yes.
So, when I was reading these, I had nothing to compare them to, so I have no idea if the numbers are right or anything else,
So all of the original ones are behind the
These back back to those are the, okay.
Those are the original.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
So,
I know there's quite a list there.
Yeah.
Again, not,
They were so
kind of not,
different.
not
They
a
were-
red line because.
And they were really hard to
they're so
compare
different.
though, just looking at them, I thought they were just,
Yeah, sorry.
gotcha. Further discussion? Do you want to go back and read them now?
I did read them. But the
No, I meant
numbers are
the-
so
I meant the-
different between
I meant the,
them.
oh, okay, gotcha.
They're so different, I didn't know that I was reading them.
Fair enough. I wasn't trying to. All right, any more discussion on the motion? In favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries.
Mr. Chairman, that's all.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin. Is that it? Joe? Is that it?
Yep.
We are to the end. Recap of to-do list. To my knowledge, we don't have anything on the.
No to-do list, just a reminder of the special board teleconference call this Thursday at 3. So I will be sending out documents. A lot of you got the hard copy documents, but I'll send out electronic documents to the full board. And then Dana will also be sending out a conference call, so the call-in number for everyone.
And are you going to physically be
It will be usual, but
It will be in the large conference room, yes. And then David will be supplying the audit report draft that he wanted comments on.
Oh, sure. Anything else today? Joe?
The one last thing, as part of the work plan that's in kind of the appendix in the back on the May meeting, it's listed at the bottom there, the trust fund investment pool will be reviewed and the international equity asset class will be reviewed. We've decided we're just going to do a broader fixed income review and we will not review the international equity asset class. So when you see the agenda for May, there will be that change.
Thank you. Anything else? All right, believe it or not, I think we're half hour early adjourned. See what happens when David leaves?